All right, good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the Planning Board and valued community representatives, I welcome you all to this evening's assembly of the Saco Planning Board. As chairman, it is my privilege to convene this gathering dedicated to the thoughtful planning and development of our community. Today, we come together with a shared commitment to shaping the future of our city in a manner that reflects our values, respects our heritage, and fulfills the needs of our residents, both now and in the future. As we engage in deliberations this evening, let us remember the profound impact these decisions will have on the lives, keeping in mind we are residents like you. It is our duty to maintain transparency, fairness, inclusivity in our proceedings, ensuring that voices of all are heard and respected. Together, we must embrace the responsibilities entrusted to us by our community, working diligently and thoughtfully to chart a course that fosters growth, prosperity, and harmony. With that, I would like to call this meeting of Tuesday, March 5th, 2024 of the Saco Planning Board to order. I look forward to the productive discussions and meaningful outcomes that lie ahead. Thank you. With us this evening, we have all members present. Myself, Matt Provenzel, the chair. To my left, Joyce Leary Clark, our vice chair. To her left, Jeff Brucho, Rob Biggs, and Jim Olier. And to my right, Jeff Grossman, Matt DiCiani, with our city staff, Emily Cole Prescott and Lisa Harmon, along with Shannon Chisholm, sorry, with our council liaison, Phil Hatch. Thank you, Shannon. This evening, our first item of business is the approval of the minutes from February 20th, 2024. Upon review of this, do any board members have any questions, comments, concerns, or edits?
Mr. Chair, I think that just the same comment would be that I understand we might be discussing this evening whether the board wishes to make minutes in the future more I can't think of it, detailed in terms of what the public comment has been. But I understand we're discussing that this evening. So with that being said, I'd move to approve the minutes of the February 20th, 24 meeting as presented.
Thank you, Joyce. A second by Jim. Any discussion? I guess, Joyce, I had one note in here. Under item 3, towards the end of the paragraph, Jim seconds the motion. It carries 5-1. I just wanted to make sure, I think in the notes here we have Matt, Joyce, Rob, Jim voting in the affirmative. I think we need to include myself in there as well. I know I voted there in the 5-1 there, but I think verbally it wasn't there, but more at the end. So I think if we put me in there as well, I think that adds clarity, not confusion to the 5-1. That's my only note in there.
Well, I'm happy to amend my motion to include that correction.
Thank you, Joyce. Jim, yes?
I just wanted to note one of the, later on the agenda, but it has to do with the minutes. We received some correspondence, and there was a concern that maybe the chair hadn't voted in that particular matter. So it should be 4-1 instead of 5-1. I looked at our standard operating procedures to see how, see if there was some definition as to what constituted voting. And while it's obvious that the rest of us need to affirmatively make some sort of gesture or say something so that you would know we voted one way or the other, I don't think that that necessarily prevents you from knowing how you're voting if you're the chair, and you knew you voted yes on that. I think that that's sufficient to justify a 5-1 vote instead of a 4-1 vote. So I'm just making that comment because I suspect we'll be addressing that later in the general correspondence, but I think it did touch upon the minutes, so I think it was important.
Sure. And what we've done in the past, the verbal has sort of come during the COVID process where we were on Zoom, and that was, I believe, Emily could correct me, I believe that was a requirement to going to the virtual meetings when we did that during COVID. But I don't think historically we were doing verbal votes. I think I raise our hands kind of before around the room. I know the meetings here have evolved a little bit throughout the years, but yeah, definitely something we'll, I guess, make sure we want to add clarity to that. Yeah.
Right, my point is that I don't think it was necessary for you to, on the record verbally say that, that you were voting affirmatively if you acknowledge your vote was affirmative in doing the tally.
Yes, yeah, I'm following, yes. Thank you. So, Joyce, amended her motion. I guess that lead.
Second.
Second, thank you. Any additional discussion? Those in favor? Matt?
Great time. Yes.
Jeff?
I'll abstain. I wasn't present at the meeting.
Joyce?
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
I would vote yes as well. Motion passes 6 with 1 abstention. Excuse me. So this evening, we do not have any applications to review. There are no public hearings this evening. This evening is just a training for the planning board here, so there aren't no public hearings, no public discussion or comments or anything this evening. So with that, moving into our next agenda item this evening, Emily, we have some IT training, we have a video, and then we have our annual training here with Mr. Saucier.
Yes, thank you. So our IT department puts on training videos that all the staff is asked to watch. And so we ask the planning board members to watch it as well because you are all issued city email addresses and iPads. And I see that everyone received their new iPad tonight. So if you have any issues with that, certainly happy to troubleshoot anything through our IT department. But I'm going to go ahead and ask communications to go ahead and play that video now.
When you are out in cyberspace, whether that be on the internet or at your computer playing solitaire, you need to authenticate. This proves to the system who you are. After the system knows you are who you say you are, it will give you all the secrets that it holds for you and those who you collaborate with. Passwords work a lot like buying a case of beer in your 20s. To access the drink, you need to prove to the cashier that you are eligible. Here, you are authenticating to the cashier with your driver's license that has your date of birth. So, you are the username and the driver's license is the password. Now, in order to ensure that someone cannot guess your password, you will want to create one that is strong. You probably have heard the common rules. Use both uppercase and lowercase letters, numbers, special characters, and a minimum of 10 characters. Following that logic, I should be able to use my pet's name and my birth year to create a solid password of Grace 1992 ! That may seem like a good password, but it's too easy to guess. Anyone I have discussed my dog and my birthday with, including anyone who I've added on social media, could guess that. Instead, you should try to develop a password phrase. My go-to method when creating a password phrase is to open a dictionary or random word generator, pick 3 to 4 words, string them together, sprinkle in some numbers and some special characters throughout. So, in this example, we have party @ shift ! filter 9 channel 2. This combination of characters would be quite difficult to crack. So we have our strong password. Hooray! It's time to start using that puppy on every website and software we need to access so we can easily remember it, right? No. Unfortunately, we should not be using the same password for everything. Say that you use the same password for your Gmail as you did for the website you used to publish that Harry Potter fan fiction. A year later, you find out that your Gmail password has been changed and your family is receiving weird emails from your account. How did this happen? It turns out the fanfic website was compromised in 2020, along with the same password you use for everything. And to make matters worse, you cannot get into your Amazon account. If you would like to check to see if your email has been a part of a compromise, there's a free tool called haveibeenpwned.com. This is a searchable database of all known data breaches. For example, let's see if my old email from high school has been a part of any compromises. Typing in my address and clicking pwned will reveal that this account was found in several breaches. I now know I should change my password on several websites. Another useful feature of Have I Been Pwned is the password checker. Just go up here to the top and click passwords. Now I'm going to type in one of the most common passwords around, password, all lowercase. As you can see, this is not a strong password at all since it's been found in more than 3 million breaches. By contrast, let's try a more secure password from before. As we expected, there has been no pwnage found. Lastly, you can have the site send you a notification if your email is found in a breach by filling out the form here. I can hear you through the screen. Well, if I'm not to use the same password everywhere, how in the heck am I supposed to remember all these stinking passwords? The best advice for this is to use a password manager. This is a piece of software that will securely store your passwords for you to retrieve later. Some of them can even autofill passwords and suggest a new strong password so you do not need to think of one yourself. If you are currently using the Microsoft Edge web browser, you already have one built into the system with your sacomain.org email address. When you go to enter your password into a site, simply click Remember this password and Edge will do the rest. There are others as well, such as LastPass and 1Password. All of these can also check their database of breaches to alert you if your account has been compromised. If you wanted to create a LastPass or 1Password account for your personal passwords, I would highly recommend it. Also, you will want to set up MFA on these. MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is when you need to use more than one means to verify yourself. The 3 forms of authentication are something you know, like a password, something you have, like a cell phone, and something you are, like a fingerprint. Going back to the beer purchase, you may only need one form of authentication, something you are. But if you look too young, you are required to also present something you have. This additional level of security prevents those without proper credentials from acquiring restricted resources. By adding MFA to your accounts, you will require an additional form of authentication of anyone who is trying to access your account. So when your Amazon account was compromised because of your Harry Potter fanfiction, the malicious actor could not buy $600 worth of Fortnite gift cards without also putting in your 6-digit code from your cell phone. MFA makes it harder for others to steal your cyber identity and ruin your day. In summary, passwords are used to identify to a system you are who you say you are, and what resources you have access to. Using a long and complex password, along with multi-factor authentication, will help prevent anyone from impersonating you. Be sure to use a different password for each system you access so that if there is a security breach, someone won't be able to access your accounts using the same password, like your Amazon or online banking. Remember to use a password manager like Microsoft Autofill or LastPass to ensure that you can remember all of your unique passwords. If you have any questions about the content in this video, please reach out to anyone in the IT department. We will be glad to answer any questions you might have. You might have subscribed to receive marketing materials or a newsletter of some kind and thought that spam might be potentially harmful. Spam tries to sell you something rather than convince you to share protected information, so if you see an email like this, you're safe to delete it. However, there are threats that lurk in your inbox in the form of phishing. Phishing is when a malicious individual attempts to convince their target to provide sensitive information using email as a primary tool.
Looking at this email when it came in on my computer, the first thing that popped up was the big yellow banner that says that the email originated from outside of the city domain. Anything that has that banner that comes from someone that works at the city, like this email is supposedly from the city administrator, gives sort of a red flag to me. It should not have that banner if it's coming from inside our network. At the very top of the email, above the yellow banner telling me that it's from outside the city domain, the email address in the brackets next to Brian's name is actually canerathbrian@fish.farm. Obviously, that's not a legit email.
After you receive an email, it is always a good idea to check the sender. At a quick glance, you can tell if it is from outside our organization if our emboldened banner has been added to the top of the email. Another way to identify the sender is to check the sender's email address. In the email, we can see that Brian's email did not come from a sacomaine.org address.
When I get an email and I think it might be phishing, one of the things that I do is I will check to see who did it go to. Did it go to me? Did it go to other people in the organization?
It is always a good idea to check the to field of an email and ask yourself these questions. If you're the only recipient, does it make sense that you are the only one to get this? If you're not the only recipient, do you recognize the group or other recipients? Are you expecting an email from this person? Answering no to any of these questions may indicate that the email you are looking at is a phishing attempt.
He says, "Good day. Please complete this employee satisfaction survey." Brian's never sent me an email that just says, "Good day. Please complete this." So that would be a little bit of a tip-off. The email asked me to follow a link, which is interesting, and just to go to a link, which I will not do. And then if you complete this survey before, I love how the spelling is obviously wrong, so that's always a good indicator, especially because some people do misspell words in emails, and you might know some of those people, but Brian usually does not misspell words in emails, so this is not from Brian.
While reading through an email, pay close attention to the language. Many phishing emails have spelling and grammatical errors, unnatural ways to present information, a sense of threat or urgency, discussions of payment or money, or requests to provide a login or other personal information. Any of these could be an indication of a phishing scheme.
And if you hover over the link, it also warns me that it's no good.
That's correct. Hovering over a link will reveal where it'll take you. So when you did that on Brian's email, you saw one strange link and not something that you would expect.
If I have a question about whether it's authentic or not, sometimes I'll actually call the person that it's masquerading as, just to call them to see if they actually sent this or not.
After going through all of that, you still think your email might be legitimate. The next step is to contact the person who emailed you by phone using a known good phone number. This will either eliminate any doubt that they sent the email, or it'll let them know that their account has been potentially compromised.
I would just mark this as fish alert, which I do mark a lot of things as fish alert, so.
If you suspect that an email is a phish, feel free to report it using the fish alert button. This is a tool that forwards the email to IT to investigate and deletes it from your mailbox. To use it, click the Fish Alert button from the Home menu in Outlook, then click Fish Alert. This function also works from Outlook on the web. If you see a phish email while on your cell phone, you can delete the message so you can avoid accidentally clicking the link. We've gone over how to avoid a phishing email, but what happens when you do fall victim? The first thing you should do is change your password, and any password that is close to the compromised one, to something new and unique. Next, let IT know of the potential compromise so that we can monitor your accounts for suspicious activity. After a compromise, you may not see the effects for a few days, weeks, or even months. If you start to get MFA prompts that you are not expecting, do not approve them, as this could be the bad actor. If coworkers start asking you about unusual emails, other strange behavior, the bad actor could have access to your account. If you'd like to further discuss phishing or other IT-related topics, please reach out to the IT department with a help desk ticket.
An improperly secured workplace can be far too easy to find. Do you have confidential documents lying about? Passwords book left in an open drawer? Or an unlocked workstation when you are away? If so, the password pilferer may strike. Legend has it, the password pilferer hones in on a messy desk. See how you can easily spot sensitive information on the documents. The password pilferer can swiftly glance around, learn what he needs, and disappear back into the shadows. A clean desk acts as a natural repellent to the password pilferer. And no, this does not mean you need to clean off your candy jar. However, you must remove any documents that might have confidential information on it while not in use. To prevent documents from being read and pilfered, you should file away sensitive documents in a locked drawer as soon as they are no longer needed. Turn any documents that you still need but are not actively using upside down. Shred any documents you no longer need. Use electronic documents whenever possible. Without taking these measures, the password pilferer could use that information to steal your cyber identity, potentially sell it on the dark web, attack your organization, harm innocent bystanders, or commit fraud. Under keywords or mousepads, inside of drawers, and attached to monitors and desks. That's right, the password pilferer knows where you are hiding your passwords. If you think you have found the best place to store your password, just remember, he has password in his name. Instead of storing a written account of your digital identity, keep your passwords committed to memory or in a password manager. When you step away from your desk, do you remember to lock your computer? If not, the password pilferer may not need your credentials to pose as you. Even if you are running to the bathroom, you still need to lock your terminal. You never know how long you might be gone. Simply press the Windows and L keys together to quickly secure your machine and thwart the password pilferer. The password pilferer does not always work alone. Aided by Cryptocracker, they can compromise your workstation with ease. That's why you need to ensure your computer receives important updates. To do this, simply restart a computer whenever you are done using it and do not turn it off. This will allow the device to download and install updates overnight. Remember, the best defense against the password pilferer is to attend a clean workspace. Keep important documents away from wandering eyes. Passwords should never be stored in accessible locations. Lock your workstation whenever you do not have line of sight. Keep your computer at the sign-on screen overnight so that the Information Technology Department can apply updates. Stay safe. You never know when the password pilferer will strike.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for watching.
All right, next item, Mr. Saucier.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. And I thought I'd just briefly introduce myself for those board members I haven't had a chance to meet. My name is Phil Saucier, and I'm the chair of the municipal department at Bernstein Shore in Portland. We represent a large number of municipalities and throughout the state, really, but concentrating in central and southern Maine. And as some of you know, I'm brought in from time to time to assist this board as special counsel. I'm not the general counsel to the city, but I do come in from time to time. So I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that we may have done a similar training with one of my colleagues. It was during the COVID years, so I remember it was on Zoom, and it was a combined training. So this is just going to touch upon, it's a nice refresher. I think it's always good for boards to just go over some general sort of highlights of sort of boardsmanship. I'm also going to touch upon what a conflict of interest is under Maine law. I'm going to go over the Freedom of Access Act, and this will qualify as your training for the Freedom of Access Act. And then finally, I'm going to go over just some sort of brief jurisdictional issues for this board, what applies to this board. So informal, ask questions. I'm not going to take too much of your time tonight, but I'm always happy to engage in some questions. One thing I will not be doing this evening is talking about any specific application. And we'll actually talk about why we're not going to talk about specific actions, but I will not be addressing any specific application, either prior or future or current. So we're just going to keep this general. The first thing I like to talk about is what I call tune-up considerations for public board members, and these are really things for all public board members to think about when we serve our roles in municipal government. And the roles you are playing and the council plays and all the committees play are extremely important to our government. And sometimes it's good to remind yourself of that, the role you're playing. It's increasingly a difficult job. There's a lot of attention on it. You are volunteers at the end of the day, right? You're not doing this for any profit or gain of your own. It's really because you care about the community and you know there's a need. And so it's something that I take very seriously personally. Obviously, I've devoted my career to it. I take in my personal life. I've chaired and been on a zoning board myself. I've never been on a planning board. I've been on a zoning board. I've been on a conservation commission. I'm currently on my town school board. It's something I'll probably always be interested in doing for my whole life. So it's something I care deeply about, and I know the tough job you have. So some of these things are just to keep in mind as you're sitting in your role to engender confidence in the public in the role you're playing, and that's really part of what you're doing is providing a process for in your job, particularly planning board matters, so that people feel confident in what you're doing. Your first job in your role is to serve your municipality and its mission, its legal responsibilities, and to that end, you are not letting your personal feelings get involved. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the decision-making process. Or you have a fiduciary duty to serve the town, to apply the ordinances as written, whether you like those ordinances or not. It's irrelevant. Right? You're not the legislative body that enacts the ordinances. You're the one who applies it. So that's something always important to think about when you're going through an ordinance, you're going through an application, is that the ordinance is the law in this town, in this city, and you need to apply it. And to that end, and some of this stuff is very basic, and don't take offense, treat people fairly. That actually goes a long ways in the job we have. It really does. People want to be treated fairly and with courtesy and with respect. And likewise, you deserve to be treated the same way, I think, in your role. To that end, we try to have our processes be sort of with civility and appropriate decorum to a board process. So I know that I've been in front of this board enough to know that you do follow process, you take motions, you keep order. But that's a very important thing for people to continue to feel confidence in what you do. People should speak to the chair and not each other. You shouldn't have discussions from the audience to individual board members and back and forth. It's a way to keep order in what you're doing, and it should be commonly applied. We operate under Maine's Freedom of Access Act. I'm also going to talk about that in more detail. And what that means is every one of our meetings, with some limited exceptions, are open. People can come in and listen. People have an opportunity to be heard, to hear how you're deliberating. And they can participate when it's time to participate. That doesn't mean there's unlimited public participation under Maine's public access laws. You can run a meeting. People speak when it's time to speak. When there's a public hearing portion, you can limit the time, and I think this board does have a time limit. You're allowed to do that as long as it's appropriate. I always do say it's 3 to 5 minutes is typically what you'll see if there is a time limit. I always say it's still always good to sort of err on the side of more time. And people like to, I think it's important for people to be heard. That doesn't mean it's unlimited. You have to do your job. You got to get your work done. But if there's a particular issue of a lot of importance, it's good to hear from everybody. Matters that you decide they do need to be decided on the information that's presented to you as part of the record. That's a very important principle of public bodies, particularly quasi-judicial bodies like you are. You really need to not discuss outside of the meetings, the applications, with either members of the public or yourself. Again, that's particularly important with quasi-judicial bodies like yourself. There are some nuances when it comes to counsel, when they're in their public, when they're not reviewing any particular application per se, they're not sitting as an adjudicatory body. Obviously, counsels are a little different than they're making public policy, so that they can have opinions about things, they solicit information. When you're sitting in a quasi-judicial body, it's a very different thing. You should not be soliciting information outside the meeting. You should not be discussing an application outside the meeting. You should be looking at the record that's been presented to you, whether it's through written submissions or testimony, that everyone sees the same thing. That's important not only to make sure that the public proceeding is operating above board, but it's also a due process issue. It's actually a constitutional issue. That the applicant and any opponent or supporter has the right to understand what information you are basing your decision on, and the right to rebut that information. So if you're getting information that no one else knows about, you're depriving people the opportunity to understand what is going through your head when you're reviewing an application, and the opportunity for someone else to present some sort of rebuttal evidence. So that's a very important principle. That doesn't mean that you can't rely on, and this is a subtlety, it doesn't mean you don't rely on your personal experiences. We all come to our jobs who we are. We all have different backgrounds, different experiences, different educations. And obviously you're gonna look at the information in front of you through that lens. That's allowed. What you should not be doing is going out and doing independent research. You shouldn't be, soliciting advice from individual members of the community or the applicant, and you certainly shouldn't be going out and doing like doing site visits by yourself and investigations. That actually does happen. There's some case law when that happens, and that, typically the answer is if that's raised and it's true, it's overturned. Your decision can be overturned on that basis. Yes?
So, living in Saco, driving by areas that there may be an application, are we to turn around and not go near that area?
No, I think there's a common sense element of this rule.
I'm all for common sense. I'm just asking, though.
I'll give you an example what's the difference, right? So we all drive by every day. You can't help but see things, right? So you're gonna notice that. There's a difference between going and then getting out of your car, walking around a site, investigating, right? That's a different type of level than you're just driving by, and obviously you can't unsee things. There's a common sense element to this. It's really when you are doing your own independent investigation, that's what you should not be doing. To me, it's a pretty clear distinction, right? Like, if you're gonna walk down Main Street and there's a Main Street project, you're gonna see the context. It just is what it is. The one thing that I think you could do, although I don't even think you would need to in that context, but if it's an off the beaten path kind of place that not everyone would be going every day, you could disclose, I'm gonna get through the conflict of interest section, you could disclose at the meeting, I just want everyone to be aware that I'm aware of this site. I go by it, I live somewhat near it, and so I just want to know I'm aware of it, but I haven't, I've never done my own independent investigation about this. And just disclose that you have that kind of relationship to the site.
Phil,
Yeah.
quick question for you as well. So let's say traffic comes up a lot during our meetings. So let's say there's a particular scenario where traffic is a pretty important piece to the puzzle. And let's say it's an area that one may avoid, because I know traffic is, they typically avoid this particular area because there's traffic. Let's say you start reminding yourself, how that traffic is. Not necessarily going out of the way, but maybe another direction. How does a scenario like that, may it fall into?
So I think you can bring that up during your discussions and allow, so again, your decision needs to be based on evidence in the record that's being presented to you, right? And so you could have questions of the information that's being given to you. So the traffic reports, for example, from your personal experience. Again, we all bring our personal experiences to it.
Sure.
The difference in, I'd say one of the differences, what I would say would not be allowed is say it was a traffic report, you're looking at the traffic, and then you go out and call, you have a friend who's a traffic engineer, right? And you say, could you take a look at this and tell me what you think? I'm gonna be looking at this at the meeting next week.
Yeah.
That would be the kind of investigation or the kind of independent analysis that you're asking for just for yourself that you should not be doing, right? That it's really got to be information for everybody to be hearing, and so that people can react to that in public and be able to provide rebuttal evidence.
Sure.
I touched upon this already, but so a couple questions, yeah.
Yes, Mr. Saucer.
Hot topic here.
Yeah, I just wanted a little bit more clarification because, I think some of our background's very technical. And obviously going out and investigating a site is taboo.
Right.
But like using Mr. Provincial's example of traffic, if you're listening to a applicant before you and their traffic engineer is presenting data and their studies, and you recall very clearly that another application not too long ago or a municipal traffic study had some different findings that might be conflicting. Is that considered inappropriate to be researching what those findings were so you can question their traffic engineer, because it's not part of the same application. I mean, it's stuff that is within the city record and has been out there, and if you reference, hey, there was a similar traffic study for this intersection, and it was noted very high crash ratings 3 years ago, how has that changed in your traffic study? Is that still considered?
That's a good question. So to the extent that you want to rely on other information that has been presented to you, what I would say is I would ask staff to review for that information and then provide a copy to everybody, so that everybody has the same information that you're asking for, including members of the public. That would typically be, and I know that this staff does that, you ask the staff for some information, they provide a memo to you, and here's what you've asked at the last meeting, I'm providing it. Everyone gets to see it. And then you can then ask some questions based on that. I do not recommend, even if it feels like it's, you're doing it to sort of make yourself a better board member, I would not recommend going back and researching those issues yourself, because you're now going down the route of your independent investigation. And that is what courts have said is not allowed, and it could put your decision at risk if it was not then disclosed, if what you're relying on was not disclosed to everybody at the same, so that's what we want to be careful about. Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jeff.
It is a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, because we have board members here that have been on the board for a while, and we have a lot of experiences, and we've seen things and understood and reviewed things
Right.
Throughout the years. So that's a good question, and it makes sense. Your answer makes sense. So we can, having that experience of that knowledge, we can request staff to, like you said, research it, compare it, provide it to the board for comparison or further understanding. But that, how do I say, the public, the public and neighbors, they see things as well, and they remember, so they know that information as well, and they'll bring it up for discussion.
And that's fine. Yeah, I mean, so testimony is evidence. People can present testimony during the appropriate public portions of information that they'd like the board to hear.
Sure.
Which would be part of the evidence in the record. I do have a sort of another thought I had. To the extent that what you're asking is that there's a question about the analysis that was presented to you. So if your hypothetical traffic engineer provides the traffic report, you have some reason to doubt that, whatever it is. You could ask for additional information from the city to the extent the city has information about that intersection, so that everyone has it. Or you have the ability under your ordinance, and I think in your inherent authority, to ask for an independent engineer to review it. And I know that the city does that too. So sometimes that's the other way I would approach it, which is I'd like to have this independently reviewed. There's mechanisms to do that under your ordinance. It's sent out. It's paid for typically by the applicant as part of the escrow fees, not always, but depending on the ordinance. And then everyone gets that third-party review. That's the way I would handle that.
And if I can just jump in here,
Yeah.
we auto-send as staff. If there's a traffic review involved, we auto-send it to our traffic peer reviewer. So that process is automatically in play. But if there's ever any more information that you want, you just have to let us know. We'll get that to you.
So I think this is great because we're all trying to maintain the city in a very defendable position. My question then comes in is, we receive a packet on Friday afternoon, and we're doing all of our reading to prepare for a presentation on Tuesday. Right. That makes it, I think, particularly challenging if we respond over the weekend. When I read my packets, it doesn't give staff much time. Is it, and I know staff is trying to be as efficient as possible to try to process applications in a timely manner. Right. Is it more appropriate that we are starting to maybe need to have a longer window? Is there a limit on the amount of time that, we have very clear timeframes about public hearings and notification and whatnot. Is there anything that says that we can't extend the time the packet's released till the hearing, where maybe the packet's released a full week before, if that's the way we need to be questioning findings?
So if I can just jump in here, because I think you're going to see a lot of changes this year, Jeff. I don't know if you were part of our discussion previously, but Anything that requires a neighborhood meeting is going to go through a 2-step review process for application completeness finding, and then the public hearing will be scheduled a month out. So you'll have the opportunity to ask us for anything additional at that application completeness finding, which will give you plenty of time to ask for anything that comes up before the public hearing. So you'll get two meeting times. We can certainly talk about increasing time, and you can ask the question of Attorney Saucier, but that is one thing that we did to help with that review, so that there's longer periods of review time between application completeness and public hearing.
So I think that that's great, and lots of the things that you've implemented over the years have definitely streamlined the process. I guess, and I think we should just try it, but my thought might be, though, is that if we question things, if we have them in our heads, maybe, or public presents some information, that's only at the public hearing. We'll have already accepted the application as being complete before we have our public hearing, so we may end up tabling after the public hearing, but, and then directing staff, so.
You can always ask for more information. I know you typically do, from the applicant, from staff, from anyone really. You need more information, but then that goes through the proper channels and it's presented publicly back to you. I think Rob had a question.
Rob, sorry. Yes, thank
I'm
you.
not going to go out and do traffic counts, but if someone or the conversation in one of our meetings goes around, well, this intersection's always insane at 8 a.m. I drive through that intersection all the time at 10 a.m. Seems great. If I were to say, I'm going to get up early and drive over there at 8 a.m. and see what it looks like, is that a problem?
I would not recommend doing that, based on the current case law. Again, it's hard to...
Or just don't tell anybody I did that.
Or tell them that you did,
Or
right?
tell
So
them
that's
I
the other way to do it, right?
But then that's doing my own research. And
Right, so I recommend not doing your independent research. To the extent that you have information that is unique, you did go, the way you would do it, and again, I wouldn't recommend doing it, but if you have done that, or for whatever reason you have information, you would disclose that at the next meeting, right?
Yep.
I happened to drive through there at 8 a.m. I witnessed this. Everyone's hearing what you're saying. The public's hearing what you're saying. The applicant's hearing what you're saying. And they could then have potentially provide information that would support or rebut that.
Okay. Last question, I asked Emily 2 weeks ago, and she said that I should bring this up when you're here, was neighborhood meetings. We should never attend a neighborhood meeting, or we can. I'm not saying attend as a planning board member sitting down front saying you're a planning board member, but if you stand in the back doorway listening to a neighborhood meeting, is that inappropriate?
So neighborhood meetings are a local decision. Not every community requires them or has them. So it's not part of a standard process. What I would say is, speaking, I don't know what Saco does. You typically do not go, I assume, or recommended not to go, or you don't have guidance.
I don't know.
You're looking for guidance.
We're
So this-
looking for guidance.
Yeah, this came up, just so you know, for full context. Our neighborhood meetings, the developer runs them or the applicant runs them. We provide the meeting room space and we help coordinate the location. We attend just to offer information on general process stuff, but we don't take care of the notice or anything like that. We do give them a sign to put up on the property that says neighborhood meeting, just so people are aware who may be driving by. It's really a time for the neighborhood or people within that area to mention any concerns or questions and to learn about the proposal.
From the developer.
From the developer directly, and it's supposed to be before a planning board application is submitted to the planning department.
Okay.
And so the question came up if we could be alerting planning board members to every neighborhood meeting, which is fine. I just want to make sure that if there's a question on whether or not they should be attending or how they should be reporting that in if they do attend.
I mean, I think the best practice from my perspective would not to go. I think because this is your body, this is your setting, this is where the applications are presented to you and the public is talking to you.
What if you live in the neighborhood?
If you live in the neighborhood, I mean, you may have to disclose that. Well, let's talk about conflict of interest in a second.
We've talked
because
about
because I think it gets into that a little bit in terms
Yeah,
of...
we ran into that one where I moved into the neighborhood of a project that was before us prior to me moving into.
And the other consideration I would say is you have to be careful that it doesn't become what we call a public meeting. Again, I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. right? So to the extent that 3 more planning board members are there and is talking about it, then in my view, that becomes a public meeting. Because it's about public business or business that will be before you. And so then the city really should be noticing that as a city meeting. And so I think, from my perspective, and again, I don't know if there's anything that would prohibit you from going, but I think best practice would be for you to, that's a separate process. You have your own process, and you'll hear information about the application at that time.
Yeah, it sounds too much like doing your own research to me,
Yeah.
because you're hearing the initial conversations.
And it just sounds like the way it's structured, it's not really a city meeting per se. Because you could have a different requirement, right? You could have a different requirement which requires the developer to come and have an informal meeting with members of the planning board there, that it's in ordinance, for example. That's noticed like a public meeting, but that's not what it sounds like this is.
Yeah, Phil, I think
We have that as well. We have a sketch plan, so they can
The sketch
do-
plan is that.
Yeah, they have a sketch plan option, and then they have to do the neighborhood meeting notice for certain applications, and then the sketch plan is optional. And we always recommend sketch plan if you're doing a neighborhood
Right.
meeting.
Yeah, I think from the board's point of view, Phil, I think it revolves around a developer applicant having discussion with the neighbors, and then for the board, just understanding, how that meeting went, the context of that meeting, because I can't think of any neighborhood meeting that we've had that the developer comes in and says it was absolute horror and everybody hated the project.
Right.
So we'll come in, they've had a meeting and it went well, and then there's a lot of opposition during the discussion. So I think maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I think just maybe an understanding of discussions that were had or questions that, applicants asked or how they were addressed, just a brief overall context, I think. But as, again, a board whole getting that information, I think would be nice. Necessary, maybe not, but I think maybe just understanding, again, maybe it's not necessary, but the evolution of the project as to a developer presenting something or an applicant, having a meeting with the neighbors, receiving their comments, making adjustments, coming back, listening to them. I don't think we always get that as a board. So I think that, I know it's up to the applicant to, show us. how
Present
they
the
meet
application,
standard.
right? And hear
Exactly.
from members of the public who may have
Exactly.
been at that meeting, for example.
Sure, and that's.
But ultimately, I would say, I think that LA is very important. Obviously, the city has decided a neighborhood meeting is important part of the process. I can think of a couple other towns. City, Portland requires them, for example. That said, the process, from my perspective, your process begins when an application is filed.
Fair enough.
And things may have changed, there may have been other iterations of the project, but what's being applied for is what's in the application. That's
Sure.
what's being applied for.
Understood.
And so there will be a lot of time for that back and forth, however, with the public and things like that. But in some ways, the relevant information is what is the applicant asking for today? What are they asking for?
Understood.
What are they asking for you to review your standards against and approve or deny?
That's fair. Could we circle back, I think, to Rob's, one of Rob's questions, sort of traffic perhaps, and maybe adjusting your schedule. So what would be your recommendation to board members that drive a particular area, that is what they drive every single day? They go a particular route. How does that come into play? Is that something, does that fall into independent research? I mean,
No, I think I'd answer the same way. I just,
well,
yeah, no, I think
I just, to be fair, I mean,
yeah,
we
no,
can't
it's not
do.
independent research. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think I answered that, and I'll say the same thing, which is you can't unknow what you don't know. There's a common sense element. We all live in this town. These are small towns. I'm going to talk about this a little bit on the conflict of interest. Sometimes we even know the applicants, right? The standard here is that doesn't mean you have to stop driving a certain route. That's not a common sense thing. It means that, but you are going to go by it. And what I would often do as a board member is say, as part of your discussion, I'm familiar with that road because I drive by it every day. But just say it. But what I'm looking at in terms of applying the standards is I'm looking at, but what's the information that was provided to me? What's the evidence in the record?
Sure.
Traffic report, testimony, the information in the application, that kind of thing. Expert, engineer reports. that's what you really need to be looking at. So I would disclose, right, to the extent that it's not already obvious. You don't need to disclose that you know the area in front of City Hall, for example. Everyone knows that you know the front. There's a sort of common sense element of it. But I do think that it's maybe a little bit important, as I said to Rob, if it's sort of an out of the way, that not everyone does go back and forth. You just let people know, I'm familiar with that area of town because I actually live past there, a mile and a half past there.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with that area of town, but I'm going to have an open mind in terms of the information that's being presented to me.
Okay.
That's the way I'd handle it.
All right, thank you.
So I've talked a little bit of evidence, I'm talking a little bit more. There's also, as I said, we apply the ordinances whether we like it or not. We don't rewrite them, but we have to understand that there is some interpretation involved, right? And so we're going to interpret the ordinances, but that interpretation needs to be logical, supported by the facts. The way the courts look at interpreting ordinances is they look at the ordinance as a whole to try to find harmony. What that really means is it logical? Would you read one provision as being completely out of whack with another part, right? A court would look to see if there is some question and it's not an obvious interpretation, there's no definition, for example, that you're going to try to read it together in harmony. Sometimes you need, assistance with that from staff, or maybe you need the city attorney's opinion about that. But there is interpretation, of course. Conflicts of interest. I do want to get into that a bit. There is a statute, so there's sort of black and white conflict of interest, and there's a little bit more of a gray area. And that's the harder one, of course. But under Maine law, conflict of interest is actually a defined term under the municipal statutes, 30A MRS 2605. And what that statute says is that essentially it helps determine when an official is presumed to be essentially self-interested in connection with the application in front of you. And it's a financial test. It's a pecuniary interest test. This is one of the de facto, I call it de facto conflict of interest. And what the statute says is if you're an officer, director, partner, associate, stockholder of a private corporation, business, or other entity, in which of what the subject is before you, so the company that's applying for an application, you're an officer or some sort of director, and that you are directly or indirectly the owner of at least 10% of the stock of the company or of the business. So you're sort of a leadership role of director, officer, and you own 10% of that company, and they're up in front of you. That's a de facto conflict of interest. You need to step down from my position, and that's in Maine law. It's the so-called 10% test, we call it. That doesn't mean a lesser interest doesn't create a conflict. It's just that that's the de facto, 10% officer, director, companies applying in front of you. That section also requires, identifies a conflict of interest where the individual sitting on a board in which you have, where it says you should avoid, it says you should avoid the appearance of a conflict. So those instances where maybe you don't meet the 10% test, but there's some sort of appearance of a conflict. That can be a little bit trickier because appearance is sometimes in the eye of the beholder. But it's important to deal with it. It's important to disclose it at a minimum. It can be something like you may be an employee of the company basis. It's a business partner of some kind. It could be you're friends with the owner. There's all kinds of different ways that there could be an appearance of a conflict. And then what the statute says is you should attempt to avoid the appearance of a conflict by disclosure or abstention. All right, so the abstention is if there is an appearance and in your mind you would not be able to continue in a way that was without predisposition or bias, or at least the public wouldn't engender the public having some sort of confidence that you would. I think in those situations when you're asking yourself that question, that's a reason to step down. There are other examples, however, where there's an appearance where in your view you still can sit without any bias, predisposition, or letting your relationship impact your decision. So that's the disclosure part of that provision, right? You disclose it to everybody. So you have to ask yourself that: can I sit without predisposition or bias? And then are you able to look at the application based solely on the information in front of you and not because of that bias? You ask yourself that question, and if you think that you can still sit, You make that disclosure to your fellow board members and the public. You say why you don't think in your mind it's a conflict of interest. And then you actually have the board discuss it and vote to decide whether you should continue to sit or not. I also recommend that an applicant has the opportunity to say if they agree or not. It's their application. And that's important. First of all, they may argue you do, and they prefer you not to sit, and you can decide whether you agree or not. But it's also their application, so to the extent that there may be a conflict, and say they get an approval, their approval could be potentially at risk. So it's important to hear from the applicant whether they think that you have a conflict enough to sit or not. But again, it's a board decision, and you should consider it and have a discussion about it. And you identify it on the record. Another area that's a little more difficult to identify, but it's also a conflict, is what we call predisposition or bias. That's a more difficult one, and that's in some ways in your own head, right? Am I predisposed, regardless of what the facts are going to say in front of me, before I even review this application? Am I biased against that application, or for it, for that matter? You think that maybe it doesn't meet the standards, but I'm going to vote for that thing. I really like it. If you're in that position, that's something you should think about whether you should be sitting on this board. It's a conflict of interest in my mind, and it could potentially be seen as a conflict if someone raised it in a proceeding and then appealed on that basis. So the obvious one we like to point out in these trainings is if you've signed a petition against this, right? Like that's the obvious one, and it comes up. I hate that project, right? Whatever it is, and I signed a petition, and then it comes before you, right? You should step down. You've already said and you've put your name on something saying you don't want this thing here. So at a minimum, maybe you even think even after doing that, I can look at this afresh, but no one else is going to believe that, right? It's a minimum appearance of a conflict that could be fatal from my perspective to the application. So you should ask yourself that question. There's also sort of gradations of that, right? Predisposition or bias that you really need to ask yourself. What you really need to be thinking about is, can I review this application without predisposition or bias based on the evidence before me and vote to approve this even though I may not like it, right? Or vote to deny it even though I really want it here. I'm going to look independently at this information, and I can sit here in my role as a quasi-judicial member of this body. There's also one other type of conflict I always need to raise, and that's called familial bias, family members. It's another what I call de facto bias. So if you have this familial relationship with somebody, you should step down. And the law is very specific what it means. It's sixth degree of consanguinity, one of my favorite words from law school. Sixth degree of consanguinity inclusive. What that essentially means is second cousins inclusive. So if it's second cousins or closer, that's a familial bias. And you should step away and not sit there and vote, obviously, on someone who's a member of your, at least the way the law defines it, close family. Once you get to the third or fourth cousins, apparently the law thinks you're a little too distant, and maybe you still should ask yourself if you have predisposition or bias, by the way. You should still ask yourself that. It could be your favorite fourth cousin, and you're going to have bias towards that person. That's right. But it's outside of the thing. And then finally, my only other comment, and I'll take a question or two on this conflict, but what would happen if you failure to abstain is that the vote, your vote could be voided by a court if appealed and the issue was raised on appeal and the appellant was able to prove that. So that would be the sort of remedy, was that your vote could be voided. And the whole proceeding could be voided, actually, the whole vote of the body. I'm going to talk a little about the Freedom of Access Act. And I'll just preface by saying the legislature has decided that it has required certain bodies to have a training, and you're one of them. That was actually added just a few years ago. Planning boards were added to the list of municipal officials that need to have FOA training. Code officers are in there, town managers, town clerks. There's other officials, but they added planning board members a few years ago. The Freedom of Access Act is divided essentially in two parts. There's public meetings and public documents, right? So we're going to talk about meetings first. And the statute and the courts have both said we construe this statute liberally, meaning if there's any sort of interpretation that needs to happen, we're going to err on the side of public. We're going to err on the side of the meeting is public or the document is public. That's a directive right in the statute. And the idea is that this is the public's business, and the public has the right to see how the decisions are made, and be open to public inspection. It covers everything, and I got into this a little bit when I was talking about the neighborhood meetings. It covers all elected and appointed officials. It applies to all meetings of bodies like yours. It does not apply to meetings of staff, for example. The public doesn't have the right to go behind the staff doors and start sitting in on staff meetings. It applies to the bodies of the city. So the council, the planning board, the zoning board, the subcommittees of the council and the boards. It applies to all those kind of boards, all temporary boards, appointed boards, advisory boards, all the boards are public. There needs to be notice of any meeting of that body. The statute itself doesn't give a specific time. A lot of town ordinances do have their own requirements. You just have to follow your own ordinances, and sometimes they're different for different bodies. The statute just requires ample time. That's all I'll say. Ample time for the public to be notified, reasonably calculated to notify the general public. It doesn't also require any particular published notice, although again, local ordinances require that. And there are some specialty ordinances, which I'm not going to get into, like when you amend a zoning ordinance, there's very specific 12 and 7-day requirements in the newspaper and things like that. But for a general meeting, there is no specific requirement. It also allows you to have emergency meetings. So from time to time, and this happens really more at the council level, but from time to time you need to meet off schedule. And you're allowed to do that. You just have to give notice to the local media, interestingly enough, as fast as you notify the members. So say you, for whatever reason, I can't really think of a reason why a planning board would have to meet tomorrow, but sometimes, I know what sometimes you want to look at findings of fact, and you didn't have a regular meeting, you want to do it as quickly as possible. Okay, let's just say it was that, and you didn't have a meeting the next day. You would say, we're going to call an emergency meeting. Please publish that notice to the local media. Typically, towns have a listserv where media gets that information on email. At the same time, you're being notified, and then I would also recommend just posting it wherever possible. That the website, sometimes you have a local resident listserv as well that wants to be notified. I know you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but under the record of the meeting. Under FOA, it's a really sort of basic requirement that's required. You are required to have a record of the meeting, but that record of the meeting must include at a minimum the date, time, and place of the meeting, the members who are in attendance, and the motions and votes taken. That's what FOA requires at its essence. And the idea behind that is public needs to know when you met, who was there, and what did you vote on, right? That's the essence. That's what FOA requires. Audio and video actually now even satisfies that requirement under the statute. So if you have audio and video, that satisfies for FOA purposes. You may have other reasons to write things down or have minutes. You have to allow that record of the meeting to be available to the public within a reasonable amount of time. The public also has a right to independently record you. You may have had that or not, but the statute specifically says that, so someone could come in and have their own video recorder here if they want to. They just can't interfere with the business of the board, so they couldn't get involved, so I couldn't see you or something like that. That's what the statute says. They can't interfere with the business, but they can record you. And again, the public has a right to attend these meetings, but they don't have the right to participate per se, only during the public comment section. So the public hearings, or if the board decides in its discretion to reopen or ask for people to comment. But under FOA, there's a right to attend meetings. That's what that gets into. I'll just say one more thing about minutes, because I know you're going to talk about, quote, minutes. This is under FOA, it's called a record of the meeting. Minutes themselves, beyond the record that I just went over, are not required. Many boards choose to do so. I think it's a good idea to have minutes, personally. The question is how detailed, and I know you're going to get into that, and that's really in the discretion of the board on how detailed that you want your minutes. At a minimum, I think they should accurately describe the agenda item you're working on, what the application was, who testified. There's the general information, so that if you want to go back and have a snapshot, you want a quick snapshot to see, I find that very helpful. I think most people do. You record everything, I think, so you could go, but not everyone wants to try to go, where was that in that 5-hour period, right? At least minutes will give you a general timeline of what happened, and you can kind of use it almost like a bookmark. So at a minimum, I think that. Now, to the extent, it's up to the discretion of the board is all I'll say about how much you want in there. The one thing I would caution you on is, to the extent you're not going to do a full transcript, there could be arguments about what was left in and what was not, right? So like, almost like the more detailed you'll get, the more you have an opportunity to leave things out by mistake or inadvertently. And so I would just be careful about that, you know, to the extent you want to, you either sort of are comprehensive or you're not, right? And you just want to make sure that people don't feel like you're sort of highlighting one over the other, which is why a lot of boards that I work with have fairly minimal minutes. But again, that's up to you. It's up to you. The other comment I'll say about minutes is that the courts have said that the minutes are not the same thing as findings of fact, and I'm going to talk about findings of fact separately, so I don't want to get into that yet. But they don't take the place of findings of fact. And maybe they did at one time. There are certain boards, you are lucky to have very good professional staff. There are small towns around the state where they have no staff. And they have boards or volunteers, and they're coming up with their own minutes on their own. And there are I'll put it to you this way: there's varying levels of sophistication with those approvals. So sometimes you actually only see minutes. And what the courts have said, if that was the only thing, that's not sufficient. You know, you really need to have your own independent findings of fact. And I'll just defer to that if you don't mind, because I'm going to talk about that and it'll open up discussions of findings of fact. I'm going to briefly, executive session, so there are exceptions to both sides. There's an exception on the public meeting. Yeah.
Can we just stay on minutes for
Yeah.
half a second? What's your thought on, I guess one question that I had was, as far as the public's participation and how we address those in some of the minutes. I know one concern I had was being too specific or not specific enough. And my concern was is when the board reviews the minutes, we can't speak on behalf of the public or correct the comments that were presented in the meeting minutes or their intent or understanding if it was misinterpreted. So that
I agree with that, yeah.
What's your thought on maybe this specificity of sort of public participation in the meeting minutes or noting that in the meeting minutes?
I mean, I think at a minimum, the minutes should note who spoke at a minimum, right? So you open up the public hearing portion and, citizen A, B, and C spoke. You could go so far, and I think the legislature does this either on behalf of, or you think the legislature uses for or against, or neither for nor against. That's how the legislature does it. And so you could also go that one more step further if you wanted to indicate how. Sometimes you don't know. Some people just get up to offer comment, right? And so again, you want to sort of avoid characterizing someone's testimony in a way that may not be accurate.
Yes.
That's sort of what I was getting at in my comment, which is like you can have a transcript, which is verbatim, or you're in the realm of summarizing what someone said. And to the extent you summarize, I think you just keep it as basic as possible. This is my perspective. Again, the board can ask for more detailed minutes because you want to avoid mischaracterizing people as well. I think that's important.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Or editorializing in any way what people said. Minutes are designed to be factual, right? They're designed to sort of just say what happened.
Okay.
I'm not going to talk a lot about executive
Sorry.
sessions other than to note.
Jeff has Jeff has a thought too.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to touch on it because we've seen different evolutions of minutes over our time here. And part of my concern was, we're fortunate enough that staff typically does our draft minutes and will correct from there. And my question was kind of what you touched on. It's very hard because if you give too much detail, you're creating, without being a formal transcript, you're possibly shifting the interpretation of what was presented. But at the same token, not having anything other than a name and an address, and 22 people spoke, you don't know if they were for or against the proposed project.
Right.
And that's just kind of where, I kind of fall, but at the same token, if we do have them and they say, well, the person spoke against the traffic and pedestrian safety and lighting, and we say they were generally opposed, does that put the city in a particular position of possibly implying that yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't use minutes to imply what anyone thought.
Well,
if they said they were opposed, then that's a fact. They said it. You can go back and review, right? So you can write it's opposed. What I would avoid if someone is giving testimony, for example, and it's like you use the word, and I know you didn't mean it, but like generally opposed. I read that as a value judgment, right? You're listening to everything. They may have been somewhat negative comments. You don't know. Maybe they actually supported it and they wanted to offer constructive criticism. If they don't say, I'm opposed to this or I'm not opposed to this, I would not put those words in their mouth. I would just say what they said, or a very brief summary of what they said.
So can I ask a question here? Would it be appropriate if on our public hearing sign-in sheet, so we have a sign-in sheet, we ask everyone to put their name and address down to help us with the minutes. Would it be appropriate if we do kind of like what other state legislatures do and offer like a box where you can say in opposition, in favor,
Or neither for
or neutral? Because that was what I was running into, is people were actually calling my office on previous minutes when we took like more detailed summaries, and they were saying, well, you left out X, or please note me as supportive, even though they sounded like they were in opposition,
Right.
even though we were listening to the recording. So I'm wondering if maybe that will help alleviate the concern, and then that way it'll be very clear in the minutes who was opposed and who was in supportive and who was neutral. The other thing we can do is add a timestamp to the top of the public hearing and the end of the public hearing so that you can go right to the video on the timestamp and listen to
think that's a good
whoever
idea.
spoke.
Yep. I think both of those are good ideas. And, obviously people don't have to check the box, but people will. So, and if they don't, you note that too. They didn't indicate, this person did not indicate in the sign-in. I think the timestamp is appropriate, because again, if you think about what minutes are for, it's really just a factual recitation of what you did. It's so that you can go back and be reminded of what you did, but it's not a transcript. So to the extent you really want to hear what was said, you go back and listen or hear or watch, or if it's written testimony, you go back and read what was submitted to you.
So this is where I'm torn, is because I feel like the minutes are kind of like that snapshot of what took place that night. And it's just kind of a quick summary. And I think that we do a very good job of being very clear that our formal record is the video. That is really what we're dealing. We're trying to direct everyone. This meeting took place. It's the video. Here's the link. You can see what you want. And I just wanted to make sure that we don't make it more difficult. I think having a snapshot is important, and Emily's point is probably ideal, other than me, who typically never signs in when I choose to speak at a public hearing, is that now that person has attested. They physically signed their name and they checked off their position, and that could be incorporated in the meeting minutes. And if I got up and spoke and I didn't sign in, maybe it should just be left undetermined. But I think it's great that they were there, and if they were willing to sign that, it would help just to say that 22 people spoke, 19 were in opposition, the remainder were in favor or neutral. And I just didn't want to get us into a tight situation, because I always defer to there is a physical record that's even better than a transcript, because you see the audio, the attenuation in their voice and the passion in their voice.
Yep.
So are we discussing minutes at this point, or are we going to wait and let Phil finish his piece and then have a section where we're going to discuss details on minutes and how we want to structure them?
I don't think the intent was to talk about how we restructure the minutes if we'd like to.
Well, later I thought we did, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to do it then, in other words?
Yes.
All right, so we'll leave some observations there.
Yes.
I do have one question. I think we may have already passed this, Phil, with regards to information that we can use to make our decision. Can we use the information we gather from public comment in the public meeting?
Yes.
So in other words, public comes up and says, you guys are nuts, here's what's going on. We can use that information because it was presented during the public meeting, during public comments.
Yes, And that's sort of skipping ahead a little bit, because I have.
Oh, I didn't know if we.
I do want to
missed
talk
it.
about
All right.
findings of fact.
Okay,
Sort of as a
go ahead.
standalone, I'll make sure to address it.
I got another one that-
I'll make sure to address it
Yep.
there. But I just want to hit a couple things, because this is going to qualify as your FOA training, so I want to make sure I hit some things for you. Very briefly, even though we have public meetings, there are exceptions. That's called an executive session. You can go into executive session only if it's one of the listed criteria in the statute. Really, there's very few opportunities for a planning board to go into executive session. It does happen from time to time. Usually, I've only seen it a few times, but it's sometimes when there's like a remand and an appeal, and your attorney wants to give you some legal advice about what the court was saying, things like that. But typically, I don't see it very often in planning boards. I don't spend a lot of time within planning boards. It's really councils that go into executive session. It's for personnel issues, it's for labor contracts, it's for selling property or buying property, and it's for consultations with their attorney. Those are some of the reasons. You have to say it in your motion. It takes 3/5 of a vote to go into executive session. And the only other thing I'll say about executive sessions is no decisions are made. You don't vote in executive session. You can discuss the issue that you're in there for, but all votes still have to happen in the public, so the public understands the decisions that are being made by that public body. Yeah.
Just wanted to touch base, because there was a time a few years ago where we had a process, it was the first time we were hearing that sort of application. And I think that maybe if we had, at least if I had been more aware, I would have asked for that, the guidance from our attorney without the pressure of the room. It was a heated debate, there's a lot of stuff going on, we're trying to figure out how to work through this application that had never really been exercised. And so that legal one-on-one explanation of process and the task at hand would be a perfect example for when a board of our capacity would ask for executive session, correct?
Right. So it's the legal standards, consultations with legal counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of the body, pending or contemplated litigation, settlement offers and matters where the duties of the council or the boards to the attorney's code of professional conduct, or where premature general public knowledge would clearly place the municipality at a substantial disadvantage. So it's the kind of things that you would talk with your attorney about. Again, there is a little bit on in your kind of body like this, where I think it's rare, and it's purposefully rare, because a lot of what you're doing should be public. And so even discussions of, like, for example, a court order is, a lot of that can still be discussed in public in terms of what did the judge say, if it was a remand, for example, what is the judge ordering you to do? Remanding it back to do what, right? So that everyone should understand why you're here. That's an example of that.
Phil,
Yeah.
with going into an executive session, that has to be during a publicly, I guess, stated meeting?
Yeah, so it still needs to be a public meeting. So sometimes the public meeting is only an executive session. It's still noticed.
Okay.
One agenda item, executive session pursuant to one MRSA 406, And then, so someone can come and watch you take that vote. And then if you vote to go to executive session, then you can leave. And then you come back out and adjourn the meeting, or take any votes that need to be public.
Okay.
Just two more brief things on meetings. One is after every meeting, and I'm going to get into this, Rob, a little bit more, but under FOA, you're required to have a written record of any decision, conditional approval or denial, setting the reasons why you made a decision in that meeting, under findings of fact. And then finally, remote meetings. That's a relatively new. You touched upon it, Mr. Chair, earlier tonight. Before, I used to give this training when it was not allowed. And so I used to say, you're not allowed to have remote meetings. Now we are, and we're all familiar with that. And you have to have a policy, as you know. You have to follow that policy. And the legislature's actually really allowed municipalities to meet remotely for almost any reason now. It started out under COVID where it was for emergency purposes only, or now you can have a policy that allows you to be remote or to meet remotely if you want to. The only requirements are that you have to let the public participate in the same way that the board members are participating remotely. So if even one board member is participating remotely, that has to be opened up, that opportunity has to be opened up to the public to participate remotely. That's the only requirement. And you have to have a policy as well. That's the other requirement.
Phil, with the findings of fact, can you, and maybe it's on your list for later, but can you touch upon the findings of fact in a tie vote? I know we've had some discussion, but how I guess the specifics of it, if the board is found in a tie vote for or against, how are the findings of fact addressed? Because clearly the board is split in its findings. But how does the board become clear with its, with its neutral vote, with its, sort of opposition within itself? How does that work, or what guidance can you provide there?
So if you don't mind, I'll put that on my list of when
Sure.
we're talking about findings.
Yeah, sure.
I'm almost through FOA. Finally, proceeding issues, I've already talked about this. Where you can get violations of meetings is when you're talking about things outside of the meeting. When you're having a meeting without really noticing it, meaning like 3 or more of you get together at the coffee shop to talk about the application, that's a meeting, right? And you shouldn't do it in the first place, but to the extent it's happening, that needs to be noticed. And members of the public should be allowed to come and watch and participate.
So, Phil,
yeah.
that would include us chatting during a site walk, too?
Yeah, and site walks are noticed. So site walks need to be noticed like a public meeting. Members of the public are allowed to go. They're not necessarily allowed to ask questions or participate that way, but they're allowed to watch and see what you're doing. And so those are public meetings, just like these are.
Right, but as far as guidance for us in terms of conduct at site walks, and we probably already know this by now, because
So
I think all of us have been on long enough, but we shouldn't be having discussions.
That's right, Joyce. That's a good point. And
site walks.
site walks are not a time to discuss the substance of the application. They're really an opportunity to do that investigation that we were talking about earlier that you shouldn't be doing yourself, right? So everyone is seeing the same thing at the same time. You're looking at it. You sometimes get a brief overview from the applicant of where it's going to go. You're kind of visualizing the thing, but you're not getting into a debate over the substance of the merits of it at that meeting. It's really a place to go and look and observe and take that information back with you to the meeting.
We're not supposed to discuss the merits of the project, but we can discuss details like, are you guys going to be putting culverts in here? What about this?
Right,
What about that?
where's this going to go? That's
Yeah.
what a sidewalk's designed to do, is to give you a visual representation of the site.
Right.
That's really what it is. To the extent you have questions, you can ask those here during the meeting, specifics.
Right, but we're not taking a vote. We're not
No.
just saying, I don't like this because of this, or I don't like that.
No, and you're not engaging in debate. You should avoid debate.
Right.
That kind of thing.
But a question to one of our board members saying, did they mention something about such and such? Is it kind of loose conversation to gather information? No, they didn't. Then you ask that question. Yes, they did. You can confirm. I mean, we're not getting into deep discussion, but certainly just asking questions along the way.
Yeah, clarifying questions.
Yeah.
That kind of thing like you get. So where was the culvert going to go?
Yeah.
Where's it going to sit on the site? Where's that building going to sit on the site? That kind of thing. That's what the site walk is designed to do. Not just be an alternative venue to discuss the opportunity, the application. Very briefly about public records, the other side of FOA. The short answer is almost everything is public, right? So everything in front of you today. Someone could ask for a FOA to see what you have. Your notes, your emails. Doesn't matter if it's your Gmail or your city email. Some people think like, oh, it's my private email. Well, if you're talking about city business, the definition of a public record is that it's any kind of written, printed, graphic, mechanical, electronic information that is in the possession or custody of an agency or official. You would all be considered officials for this purpose. And was received, prepared, or contains information related to the transaction of public business. So in other words, for your purposes, the planning board information that you're in front of. It does not relate to personal information, right? You have to be on your city email account, but you're talking about a birthday party you're going to go to. It's about public business, received, prepared, or containing information related to public business. That's what a public record is. Anyone can ask for it. You don't ask someone why they're asking for it. People can ask for it. There's a process that the city handles. Every city has to have a public access officer. In your case, it's the city clerk. It's either the clerks or the managers I've seen. But they have to be identified as that's one of their jobs. And essentially, they're the point person if a request comes in, their job is to kind of disseminate it to all the different people. Can you please look? Or sometimes they use their IT departments, and then they're the point person to get it back out. There's a process for that, in terms of response times. If to respond within 5 days. After that, they have to give an estimate of time and cost. Cities can charge now for $25 an hour after the first 2 hours of staff time. If there's a denial, you need to say within 5 days, or if you withhold it, you need to tell people you withheld it after you went through all the documents. And then finally, people can appeal that decision to Superior Court. And so if they think you didn't disclose something, or they have some sort of argument with the process. Just like public meetings, there are exceptions. So the first thing you do is you look through this somewhat long list, I shouldn't say very long, somewhat long list. One of the things that makes it complicated under Maine law is the legislature has decided not to put all the exceptions in one place. And there's no good spot. The legislature's committee has a search engine that's not comprehensive, or it's hard to find. But under the FOA statute, there is a list. So there's one place where there is a list of exceptions. And those are things like, social security numbers. Some of them are obvious. Some of them are not. Certain medical information that the city may be holding. Confidential by statute, so like general assistance applications, poverty abatements. There's certain things that statutes have identified as public, as not public, I'm sorry. Medical information, the only one I can think of about boards, there's one that was added for medical information related to Board of Appeals, interestingly enough, because you can ask for disability variances now. And so they added that. So every year the legislature looks at that. There's a committee that looks at that, and they decide if certain exceptions need to be added, if certain exceptions should be removed, and they fall all through the main titles. One of the biggest ones that cities see are police department records. So there's investigative records and criminal history record information act are two separate areas. You don't need to, it does not involve you for the most part, I think. I think that's all I have under FOA. If there are any other questions about that.
Well, just to clarify, when I'm holding up my notebook, I mean, if I'm taking notes during a meeting to create a draft motion or something, I don't need to save my little steno pads forever, do I, just in case somebody asks for them?
Not forever, no. I would keep them for some time, and this is an answer I don't have on the top of my head, but there is something called the Maine State Archives, and the Maine State Archives publishes something called the Municipal Retention Schedule. And if you haven't seen it before, it's a somewhat interesting document to look at. And it's an Excel chart, and essentially they go through and say, it's a retention schedule for all the variety of types of documents that a city may have. From vital records, original vital records, which are forever, to certain notes, which are sometimes very short periods of time, to duplicates, which can be thrown away. They have a category, and you go down through the category. The clerk's office typically is pretty familiar with those. Some are 3 years, some are 5 years, some are forever. It's very specific. So notes, I actually don't know off the top of my head, but typically it's certainly during the process, at a minimum, during the sort of planning board process, and any sort of appeal process, I would hold on to those at a minimum. There could be a longer period, I just don't know it off the top of my head. But it's a fun document to look at. Okay, finally, I'm going to get into a few more specifics. The time is kind of going further, so I'm not going to go over everything, but I'm going to talk about findings of fact. I like to just say first, before I start, this is the your powers and duties. So first, from a land use context, it's important to think about where the different powers and duties are of the different boards in this city. The city council does have a limited role in land use, zoning, and planning. Their role really is as of a legislative nature. So their job is to adopt the ordinances that you're going to apply. So that's their role in the process. They are not the adjudicatory body on land use applications. That is for you. That is you, and you're an independent board. So they don't have that job. They do adopt the comprehensive plan. Again, they adopt the ordinances and amend the ordinances, and they adopt contract zones. So that is one type of application that the city council hears. And contract zones are authorized in this city, so if someone wants a contract zone, they come to the city council. And then finally, their role is to appoint you, and that's a role in the planning process. They appoint members of this board and members of the Board of Appeals. So that's the legislative part of it. The zoning board, that's a statutory board. It's under Maine law, and then it's articulated in your ordinances as well. Zoning boards are required under Maine law if a municipality has a zoning ordinance. It's a required board. And I do much more in depth if I'm doing a zoning board, but in essence, they have three jobs. Or really two jobs. Appeals. Typically, it's either of the code officer. It's always of the code officer, typically, or sometimes the planning board. That's an option for municipalities. Sometimes appeals from planning boards go directly to Superior Court, which is the case here in Saco. But they review appeals, and then they grant variances, and that's a statutory process I'm not going to get into tonight, but they can grant variances, and again, that's only as authorized by law. Planning boards, on the other hand, you guys, it's really not a statutory body, interestingly enough. The zoning board is. The planning board is more of a creature of a local body. It is mentioned a few times in the statutes. It says municipalities can appoint planning boards, and if they have a planning board, they serve certain roles. You serve as the municipal reviewing authority for subdivision ordinance, a subdivision review, if there is a planning board. You conduct hearings, and you probably have done this, hearings for any zoning amendments, ordinance amendments. You have to do something, sometimes called the MRA review, sometimes it's just the planning board review. You have to hold a hearing, that's your only job. The city council gets to decide whether to adopt the ordinance. And then, of course, you have your own local ordinance, which gives you jurisdiction over certain things. In Saco, it's the conditional uses, site plan review, subdivisions, master plan development is in there, and then also, obviously, shoreline zoning review. Standing to be applicant, you need to have right title and interest to appear before this body in an application. What the courts have said is that what that means is you have a legal cognizable expectation to use the property in a way that you're applying for. That's the standard. So I have a right to use that property for a warehouse, right? Sometimes that could just mean that you have a deed. But the reason why it's legally cognizable is because some people have a deed with a covenant in it that says no warehouses, right? And that's being presented to you. So that's one of the standards. Typically, staff will weigh in on that and help you with that, but sometimes you are actually asked to decide if someone has right title and interest. And the only other thing I'll say about that is if there is a dispute, recent court law has said that you should defer until a court of competent jurisdiction has weighed in on that. That comes up a lot in easement fights. Someone has an easement, the neighbor doesn't think they have the right to use it the way they think they do. There's an argument about it. The court needs to decide the extent that person can use that easement. So that will come up from time to time, and I do get to ask those questions to help boards and code officers on that. Written decisions, and I'm almost done. Stop for questions. So written decisions, as I already mentioned, the Freedom of Access Act requires you to have a written decision. So I'm not going to that, but more importantly, in some ways, your ordinance requires that, and the courts require it for purposes of appeal. So if one of your decisions are appealed, the Superior Court is going to review your decision in what we call an appellate capacity. They're going to look to see, and the standard they're going to review your decision is if there's substantial evidence in the record to support your decision, whether there's an error of law, or whether there's an error of law. And that means it's very important that you have findings of fact, written findings of fact, under each standard, and I know you do, because I've seen them, that not only lists the standard, but the finding, right? So you have the facts and you have a finding, and then a conclusion that it meets the standard or not. That's very important, because that's what the court's going to look at. And if you don't have that, the court will remand it to you. And that has happened more and more frequently. I just want to point that out, that what I see more often in appeals at the first step is a remand. It happens somewhat frequently at this point. And so that's what the court's going to look at. Is there a finding? Is there at least a finding? Because sometimes there's not. There's literally sometimes you get a decision that says approved. I've seen that. Approved, right? That will immediately be sent back to that board. The court will not. They need to have substantial findings in the record to support the decision. So that if there's no findings, the court can't review it. And in fact, if I get that kind of case, and I've had that kind of case on behalf of a town, I often, with the permission of my client, the town, we'll say, let's just agree right now, because it's going to save everyone time and money. We're going to go 6 months, spend money briefing it, and then the court's going to remand it. So I oftentimes work with proposing counsel if I get that kind of finding of fact, say, let's just remand it now, get some findings. Doesn't mean the board rehears the application. It means that they're actually making findings to support what they did, and then that will go back up to the court. But I just want to I want to say this more and more because it is very important, and the courts are very strict on this, even in the time that I've been practicing municipal law. Because what the court said, judicial review is just not simply possible if they don't have findings of fact to look at. So what does it mean? Is there substantial findings in the fact to support the board's conclusion? The board's not going to step in your shoes and say, I would look at I would come to the opposite conclusion. It's a somewhat deferential review. Instead, they're just going to say, but would a reasonable person, like, is it substantial evidence in the record? Could a reasonable person come to that conclusion? Doesn't mean the same conclusion. A different standard review, which is not applicable to you, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is what we call a de novo review. In a de novo review, a court or a board of appeals is making their own independent determination. So regardless of what the underlying body did, they're going to look at that kind of review, they're going to look at the evidence and come to their own conclusion. But that's not how your decisions are reviewed at Superior Court. We call it an appellate review. So that's why the court needs to see if there's substantial evidence record to support your decision. Evidence, and I had this question earlier, I think it was from Rob or from others, is what does that mean? It can mean testimony from members of the public, from the applicant, information provided to you from staff, anything that was presented to this board. It's not anything that was not presented to the board. So external information. Email correspondence between people you may have been copied on, probably shouldn't have been copied on, but copied on. That wasn't presented to the board unless you then somehow it got entered in for everybody. It's information that was presented to the board as part of the record. That record is closed. So in the event there's an appeal, and this is why it's important to have really good organized files, is the record of that proceeding goes up to the court with the appeal. And the record is, again, anything that's been presented to the board. It's in the main rules of civil procedure. It's any transcripts if they're available, recordings, and then it's anything that was presented to the board. And then the decision, and that's closed. We call it a closed record. We're not going to add to that because, again, the board's just looking to see what you did, not any additional information. I had a question about, so you can hear everything, you can base it on anything, but of course there's going to be some weighing of evidence, right? You're going to weigh the value of the evidence or the weight of the evidence just like a jury does. A jury is presented with all kinds of evidence, but they may give more weight to one type of evidence versus the other once they sort of think about it in totality. That's something for you to decide how to sift through that evidence in terms of maybe someone's expertise or relevancy of the evidence, for example. Not every piece of evidence is going to be necessarily weighed the same, but you're going to look at it all and come to a decision and make a determination with facts. Follow up.
Personal experience allowed to enter into that?
Again, to go way back to where I started, to the extent that it's personal experience you've talked about the meeting.
I've got a lifetime of experience.
Yeah.
I was in commercial development for 35 years. Yep. Am I supposed to flush all that information out of my brain and only sit here and listen to what I hear in front of me?
So you would use that experience the way I look at it, I would use that experience on how I weigh the evidence. Right? Yeah. So you have certain knowledge, you have certain experience, certain education, and you're going to look at that education through that lens, right? So you may weigh a testimony from this particular person more than that because of your knowledge. Right. That's how that comes into play. Where it doesn't come into play is, oh, by the way, I know about this report that was done because I'm in this field, right? That's the distinction.
But in general practices within the construction management community, I've got 30 years of experience.
Right.
So I've got certainly, I wouldn't call it biases, but I've got information in my head that everybody here doesn't have. Do I have to present that to them? I mean, I guess if I were to vote no on something and somebody says, well, why did you vote no? We have to
You would say because of the evidence.
Say no because of this, and this,
That's right.
Which may be something that Jeff doesn't have because his experience is totally different than mine.
Everyone has different experience.
Right.
You just say why you're coming.
I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV.
Yeah,
But-
so
but-
to me, it gets to is how you sift through the information and
Right.
make a determination. That's, I think, where that comes into play.
And that personal experience is also, in some cases, a lifetime of living in Saco
Sure.
versus someone that's lived here 8 years.
You just need to make sure you're tying it to the standard and the information provided to you. It can't be just something completely unrelated, right?
Right.
It's got to be, okay, the standard is, natural resources. I just pick one. I don't want to pick one because I want you to read into it, right? But
Right.
that's one of them.
Yep.
Right? And so you hear various testimony, and you've lived here the whole time, and so someone said something about a particular thing, and that weighs true with you. You give a lot of weight to that, given the experience you have, and you would say that when
Right.
you're having your.
Yep.
But again, you're still pointing it to the evidence that was presented to you. So that's how you weigh it, and that's a hard job. That's the hardest part of your job, right? You heard a lot of information, then you have to make a determination based on that information, and then it just makes to make sure that the findings of fact has reasoning, at least the basic, right? Like I sometimes talk to boards, you do a lot better. There's at least a sentence, right? You need to say why. What did you find, and why did it meet that standard? If you have more than a sentence, even better, right? Point to what you found in the record and how it met the standard. You asked a question about tie votes. I think it's a good time to talk about it.
That's a great time to talk.
And so the standard is if you have a tie vote, in essence, the board hasn't acted, right? And if you can't come to a conclusion and it remains a tie, then that means that it's treated as a denial for that standard. I know that people have referred to the MMA manual. I looked at that myself. And that's what the MMA standard says. That's how I teach this topic. I haven't looked at it for a while, but I think what the MMA standard says is if a tie vote means you haven't acted, you can attempt to come to see if there is any kind of conclusion you can come to. If you cannot, it fails, right? That's if there are no more votes that gets to a majority, then it stays a tie and it's failed. That's
So if we have a tie,
yeah.
we can choose to do nothing beyond say we had a tie and be done with it.
Right.
Or we can say, let's have a little more discussion and see if we change our mind on the next vote. We can do that kind of,
You can always reconsider a vote. You
Right.
can ask to reconsider a
right.
vote. You
So
can always do that.
in my layman's terms, but
Yeah.
so we're reconsidering a vote. We have a choice.
Right.
Do we have to make a motion to reconsider that vote? Or do we just say, hey, let's reconsider this vote and let's talk about it a bit and then do another motion?
I mean, someone could always propose another motion, right? So someone
Which
could always,
would create more discussion.
exactly.
I
And
got
that
you.
could fail or it could tie again.
Yep.
But if you can't come to a conclusion,
So realistically,
it's a tie and it's a failure. If you
right.
If you don't
So
come to-
realistically, if it's a tie and someone feels adamant that we should discuss it further, the way to do that would be to make a motion,
Right.
which would then be seconded or not, and then would create discussion time and another vote.
right. And if you can't,
You
come to a
tie
conclusion,
again, you say, we're
you
done.
move on, right?
Yeah, all right.
So Phil, in the event that there's, let's say, a positive motion made,
Yeah.
and it falls under a tie vote, what's a good way or what's a clear way that you would recommend that the board communicate findings in such a way? So there's been a positive vote, but it's tied.
A
So
positive
therefore,
motion.
a positive motion.
Tie vote,
And it's a tie vote, and it therefore fails. So I think that's one piece that we've always sort of wrestled with.
You're getting defining. Let's get back to your original question.
Yeah,
defining.
defining
Yeah.
a failed motion on a positive vote.
I think there's two ways of dealing with that. Typically, if the motion will be accompanied by the reasoning, so you'll have a motion and a second, and then a discussion, right? So if the motion was for a positive finding, you'll have a discussion, and that's where you're developing your findings, right? Why is that meeting the standard? Well, you'll have proponents of that motion saying why. I think you guys have done that in the last meeting I was at, right? So I think it meets the standard because the traffic report said X, and the testimony from this person said Y. You do that, it fails. What you have right now are findings for the positive motion to get to your point, but it was a tie. So you only have this. You could keep it at that, for example, or you could say, would anyone who voted on the affirmative give their reasons why not? You could do that, and you'd have two sets of findings. But the court's going to see that as a denial, that you didn't meet the standard, right? For the so.
Sure, and I think at least my understanding is the attempt to always provide more information than less. So regardless of how the vote, its outcome, but provide the information on how the board voted. So if there is votes against either direction, just an understanding that we can put into the findings, I guess.
I think that could be helpful. At the end of the day, it's going to be a standard that's reviewed there wasn't a majority on either, right? So the review is not going to be, was there sufficient findings to support your conclusion? Because it's a little bit of a different vote. There was no conclusion, or there was a conclusion that it was a tie, right?
Sure. But if there's findings in both avenues, then that can add clarity to the decision of a tie finding.
Yes.
So then it shouldn't matter how we formulate our motion if we move to find that the standard's been met, or we move to find that the standard hasn't been met. Right. Because I guess what I'm troubled with is the double negative, that if you move to find the standard hasn't been met and there's a tie vote, then the motion fails, so that means the standard has been met?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah,
I think maybe the better practice is to.
Yeah, so I mean, it can't work.
It's not a requirement though, and I've heard people sort of quibble about that in other places. Do we have to do a negative? Do we have to do a positive? There is no rule, right? People can make a motion on what they want to make a motion for. I think it is a little clearer to me, personally, that, if it's a motion, that it does meet the standard. Because I have the same problem reading through double negatives, but ultimately accomplishes the same thing. There is no rule against that kind of motion that I'm aware of.
So if I can just ask a question over here. What I always recommend is that if a board is going, first of all, the board discuss all the standards of review before they get into making motions, so there's less confusion, so you kind of have an idea of the temperature. And then when we get into motions, if it's feeling like the temperature is negative, just make the motion how you want to state.
I agree. Yeah.
Because otherwise we'll get a lot of confusion. So not always constantly forcing something that's going to be, I move to deny in a positive motion. Because basically I move to deny is still worded in a positive grammatical format. It just has a connotation of not being positive.
I think that's a very good way of putting it.
So what you're saying, Emily, if we've gone through and we feel like nobody's going to vote for this one, everybody's pretty negative on it, we should make that a negative motion. Everybody would vote for that negative motion in a positive, therefore it is approved as a negative motion, correct?
So yeah, I don't know if you recall the guidance document. It's going to be coming back to you because we'll have another decision coming up. But yeah, that's the recommendation that I have, is make it based on.
So it doesn't produce that double negative situation.
So it's not confusing. You know, kind of back to that common sense. Have your discussion on the standard.
Yep.
And then maybe through that discussion, you see either you're missing more information that you need the applicant to provide. Maybe there's something that the applicant could provide based on the public hearing, like an amendment to the plan. We've seen that before. Or maybe the temperature is really that it's a denial or an approval based on whatever is in the record that you've heard so far.
But then make the motion in the way you think the room's going to go.
Right.
And if it goes that way, then that's fine. So that would be a positive motion. It's voted through 6-2, then, or 4-2, then we're good to go. And it's positive.
Or it might be a successful.
Successful, all right.
Maybe, yeah. And we've done that before, where I think we historically have made positive motions, whether they pass or fail. But then, to Emily's point, we have made motions in the past saying that this section has not been met.
Correct.
What we need to do, and I feel we have been very diligent about including or modifying the findings of facts during that motion to ensure that we've captured the reasoning behind it.
Right.
Because if there's a draft findings of fact presented in a positive, and then there's a motion made in the negative that it has not been met, we don't have any findings at that time, so we try to create them. We try to do it immediately, and I think successfully to date. So I think that's worked so far. Jeff?
Yeah, I just wanted to be very clear that I understood, because I interpreted some of my MMA training in the manuals that they really preferred motions to be made in the positive. And that became really problematic when we determined it wasn't going to be the case, because then you have to kind of scramble to readjust maybe the proposed findings of facts. And so what I'm interpreting that you're giving us advice is that there is no steadfast rule that says that a motion should be made in the positive.
I see motions, I see board members make motions. I make a motion that this does not meet the standard for the following reasons.
So what Ms. Cole Prescott said, taking the temperature of our discussion and
Right.
feeling like that, if we were all feeling, because I found it very awkward to try to make the motion and then remind everyone, I made that motion in the positive because I'm feeling like it's gonna fail, a negative. So the proposed plan, I think, would be more comfortable for everyone in this room to really have the vibe of where we're going, if there were to be all those findings that weren't met, that we just make the motion in the negative.
I think there's a lot of, you could get into the sort of specifics on it. Just to me, I boil down to be clear. That's the important thing. What are you voting on, right? Think about that. Positive, negative, all this. I make a motion to do this, right? Do we know what you were talking about? And then have findings. That's the important takeaway from my perspective. The court, the applicant, the public needs to know what you're voting on. You're voting to deny it, you're voting to approve it.
And
That's what I would think about when I'm making motions, right? You're being very clear with your motions.
Sure. And the guidance document that Emily and Lisa have put together, and Shannon, I think it does a very good job. And I believe even maybe recently, we've had some motions that we made a positive motion specifically outlining the draft findings in the positive, with the majority of the board not voting in favor, voting against it. And then that vote was clear with the findings that the vote or the board felt that the findings were not met for those exact reasons. And they were in the positive, but we disagreed. And I think that was sort of the clear decision.
Yep.
That the findings were in the positive, but we didn't find them.
So that leads to the last thing I was going to say about its findings, but in general, was at the end of the day, you make your motions, you make your findings, but then you have a chance to review the findings of fact document, and you actually adopt it. And you want to make sure, because staff and the courts have been clear, you can have assistants drafting those. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, it's your findings, and so you need to review it, determine if it's accurate. If it's not accurate, change it. And in some way, it's a draft for you. So that's a good point to say,
Sure.
Is this accurately reflecting the vote we had and the findings we made? Make changes to that draft document and then vote to adopt it. And that's the process. And I know you do that process already.
Thank you.
So
Jeff,
we
did you
do
have-
the verification of findings on denial. If it's approval, we do not do a verification of findings. I'm not opposed to doing that, but we just haven't made that part of our process.
Okay.
But if it's a denial, the board sees it.
Jeff, do you have thoughts too?
Yeah, I guess if we have only 6 members sitting on an item and someone makes a motion in the positive, and during the discussion, they explain why they think it should be passed, and it fails on a 3-3 vote, I guess my question is that we've talked about before, are we required, the people who voted in the negative, to explain why we voted negatively?
Are you required? No, I mean, you
Well,
need to-
right, yeah, are we required to go back and discuss why we voted in the negative?
your findings, what's really required is you have to have findings in your findings, written findings, right? And so we've talked about there's 2 different ways of doing that. There can be the motion with the findings that it met the standard, and so those will what will appear, and it'll say failed 3-3.
Right.
You can decide to add, okay, the 3 people vote against it would have found the following, right? You can do that. You can also, as I said, and I don't want to reiterate everything we've already said, but we can also, and this, again, MMA manual says it, says you can discuss, once you have a vote, you can see if there are other motions that are out there. You're allowed to do that. But ultimately, if you end up at a tie, it fails. So during that motion process, you can have discussions, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Right.
Yeah.
So we could have discussions to see if we can come up with a motion that would pass.
Right.
But we're not required to do that.
No.
And so to your question or point, Jeff, that for the same reason that board members could find that the standards were met, other board members could find for those same reasons, testimony, documents, submitted, you find that they don't meet the standards. And I think we've had scenarios like that, and I think it is a bit confusing. And
It is confusing, yeah.
And I think it's just the reassurance that we provide clear direction and clear documents and facts, just
Right.
as to the decision that was a tie vote.
Right. Because ultimately, I think what we come back to is ultimately your vote needs to be supported with substantial evidence of the record, whether you're for something or against something, right? It's not just because, that's the standard, right? That's what the court would look at was your vote supported by substantial evidence of the record. So when you're voting, I think that's what you take into consideration is my vote, if your vote passed, would it be supported by substantial evidence in the record or not? And if it's not, that's a potential avenue for your decision to be overturned. It's very important to point to, for each of these votes, where what you're relying on and your findings.
Okay.
That's all I had. We went a little time here, but any other?
I had one
Yeah.
question regarding the Freedom of Information Act.
Oh, sure.
Freedom of Access
Freedom of
Act,
Access.
whatever
I
it's
know, it's one of
called
my
now, yeah. So if I use my Gmail account
Yeah.
to communicate with Emily on an upcoming meeting, and someone asks for my emails, are only the emails relating to the city discoverable, or are all my emails discoverable?
The city business, so the transaction of public business, that's the definition. What I would say is, yeah, so if you're talking about city business on your Gmail account, that is something that would be subject to FOA. It's why it's actually a good practice to just use your Saco address.
Right.
So then you don't have to, you haven't done anything over there, and you're not going to have to go through and sort through or have some professional have to do it. That does happen from time to time. The city has the ability to use their IT department to pull based on queries. So it's better to keep it in one spot. It's more efficient, quite frankly, because otherwise you would have to go through your personal emails. It also qualifies for text messages, social media, direct messaging would qualify as a public document if you're talking about public business.
So if if we're discussing with someone, if we're going to attend a meeting or not, those texts are discoverable?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything that deals with the public business, yeah. Not the text about anything else, your private
Right.
life, yeah. But dealing with the public businesses, yeah. So what I always advise is honestly just don't write about it. I don't in my personal, there are some basic stuff, so quorum that you reply to, you're allowed to have that. It's not a meeting. There's some exceptions to the emailing back and forth, but it's really non-substantive reasons. So you'll sometimes see a query for quorum is, do we have enough people who are coming tonight? Please reply. Here's the, thank you, here's the information packet, that kind of information sent on email. If you have a real question that you want the board, everyone to know, not a personal question with like the planner, but you want this to be at the next meeting, that's another way to communicate, but I wouldn't engage in substantive back and forthing at that point. You're passing it on and then it's disseminated properly. But I think the general rule for me is just avoid it. You really don't need to be talking. I mean, there really isn't a reason, if you think about it, to be talking about your work outside of this room, other than the dissemination of the information to you. There really is no reason. Okay. Yeah.
So Phil, one question I have is, and this goes in with the tie votes. So suppose a lot of these applications are multi-meeting events, right? And so suppose one of the members is unable to, attends all the meetings, but is unable to attend the final meeting when the voting takes place. And it ends up being a tie vote, 3-3 vote.
Yeah.
So at the next meeting, the person who couldn't attend is there, so you have 7 members again. And if the person who missed the meeting can look at the record, watches the whole video, audio, looks at all the documents that were presented at that meeting that the member missed, could the board then revote on that application now that there are 7 members?
That's a good question, yeah.
And could that member participate after reviewing all that information?
So there is something under Robert's rules called reconsideration. You know, it's a vote for reconsideration. So there would have to be, in my mind, either a new motion, but I think in this case, if time has gone by, there's been a vote, you're at a motion to reconsider. There's certain rules around that. So a motion to reconsider is supposed to take place at the same meeting, or I think it's the next meeting. Under Robert's rules, I don't have Robert's rules memorized right now, but I think that's true. It needs to be made for someone who's in the positive. That's confusing when you're talking about tie votes, right? So I actually don't know the answer. I might have to get back to you on that, on who can make that motion. But then it's a 2-part vote. There's a motion to reconsider that vote. That passes or fails. If it fails, you're done. If it passes, it reopens the original vote, and then you have a new vote. That's the effect of a motion to reconsider. It's a two-part standard. I think to the extent you do that at a subsequent meeting, you should notify. It should be it's supposed to be on an agenda item technically, so that people actually know you're going to make that motion, and the applicant or other interested party can show up and participate or comment. So I think there potentially is a process. I think that could be.
So
I have not seen that before in my practice.
So my question, though, also is the member who missed the meeting, but
Yes.
reviewed all that information, could that member who missed the meeting with the original vote took place, can that member participate?
That's a good question. That's actually something I typically go over. So as a general matter, not talking about reconsideration, the answer is yes. If you've missed a meeting, you are allowed to participate. However, you should say on the record, and actually do, go back and review all the previous submissions, all the testimony. You should actually watch the proceeding. So essentially familiarize yourself with everything that happened publicly. And then you say it on the record. You say, I'm up to speed. I went back through the record. I listened to the meeting. I read everything. In my view, I'd like to continue to participate. I think, I don't go this far, but I think if you look at the MMA training, they actually suggest you actually sign an affidavit and put that in the record, an affidavit saying you actually did all that. So that's, you could go that far, but at a minimum, you disclose it and you say it publicly, and that kind of thing. But yes, the answer is yes, you can.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
In that event, isn't the board and the applicant supposed to agree that they can participate? Aren't we supposed to have the board vote on their fit?
I see different practices on that. I think you could, but I also think that if a board member makes that statement, has done everything, and makes a proclamation on the record, that they could sit. I do think that even the MMA guidance suggests that you should ask in similar conflict. I'm not aware of any.
And wouldn't the
court
public affirmation of what you've been through, I've
Yeah.
done this, I've done that.
Right.
That's in a public domain, in a public meetings being recorded.
Right.
Would be in lieu of an affidavit, I would think. In
Right.
today's day of
You're
technology,
making a public certification.
compared to 10 years ago when nothing was recorded or
Right.
at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The key is you actually have reviewed the record.
And declared it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the key on that.
So we have done a reconsideration before, back in 2019, and we did follow all the formal processes and Robert's rules.
Yep.
And it was a matter where the board had actually approved the application, and then we had to reconsider. The board reconsidered and denied it, and it was on the agenda. And there were multiple reasons involved, but we did follow all the correct processes.
That's right.
And then just on the tie votes and the denials, when we are hearing votes that are negative, if the motion's made in the positive. I have been asking board members to please report in the reasons for the denied vote, just because of the applicant is the party to the application, and they've been, both the public and the applicant spent a lot of time providing details and information. So I've been asking for that so that we can have that to support our draft findings of fact.
I think that that's good practice, as I said. I do. I think it's good practice because, again, you'll have the reason, and each board member, is supposed to be doing that anyway when they vote. So again, you're supported by substantial evidence in the record. That's the standard the court would look at. So I think it's good practice at a minimum. Yeah, and it provides the applicant. I mean, one of the reasons for written decision is to provide for meaningful judicial review, but also to give the applicant information on why they met the standard or why it was denied. That's one of the reasons for written findings.
So, Phil, I was going to ask, and I just looked it up.
Yeah.
I did my independent research here for a second.
That's all right. We're not hearing an application. We're not hearing an application.
But it's on Robert's rules, because
Yeah.
I as well haven't
Yeah.
memorized them. I just wanted to make sure, you mentioned that the motion to reconsider was from a majority vote, or the prevailing side, as you mentioned. So in a tie vote, it must be the no vote, it seems, here. I wanted to ensure that it wasn't the person who had made the original motion must make a motion to reconsider. But so in Jim's instance there, it's maybe perhaps another meeting, but the board, perhaps assume they've made a motion on each individual criteria and then an overall motion. So I suspect the motion to reconsider could be any portion, but common sense says it should be for the original or the full application. And then from there, do we see it and go through every section again, or do we go through specific sections? Because the Roberts rules are clear that it can't be just because they weren't happy with the vote.
Right.
There has to be additional information presented or reviewed. So I hear it's a good question.
That's part of the
Part of the reconsideration. Yeah. So that's.
Are you asking? You're asking if after there's a vote on the full application?
Well,
I think that's what you
I guess-
said, instead of reopening the individual votes inside the application?
Yeah, I guess I want to be clear that if there's a reconsider for a motion to reconsider, it must be a reconsideration of the motion made on the application. And
Yeah, it's a
then-
motion to reconsider a motion
and-
that's
and
been
then-
passed,
And then it must be for the whole thing. We can't simply go back and pick and say, I want to do that one section, right? Because that's, unless it's specific that there's additional information that's been received and needs to be reviewed, I guess it then could be on that one particular section. I guess it's just seems to be a very confusing.
I think I know what
muddy
you're saying. I don't know if I
situation.
know the answer. So what you're saying is, you go through 20 standards, you have a vote to approve. Someone at the next meeting says, I vote to reconsider that approval,
Sure.
right? Now and it's successful. Now you've actually reopened the motion to approve.
Right.
You're back at that stage.
Sure.
And
Do we
so
need to go
you
back
would have
through the
to,
20
and again, this is all
sections?
theoretical, so I don't like to act in the theoretical.
I know, that's
So if I get a question from board, we'll have to think about the circumstances. But I think in that circumstance that we just said, you're back at okay, you've gone through each of the standards already. None of those have been reconsidered. You reconsider the final vote, right?
Right.
And so then you would have another motion to approve or deny. If you deny, you have to say why, right? So
Sure.
if you have all the 20 and you have positive votes on all the 20, I think you'd have to give a reason why, or you'd have to actually, I guess, reopen one of the other ones. I don't want to go too far down that, honestly, because I'd like to think about that. If that came to me, I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Sure, and I
on
guess
how
I'm-
that procedurally would work.
Yeah, because I guess I'm thinking in the sense that we had an absent board member for whatever reason.
Yeah.
The motion doesn't make sense to me to make a reconsideration of one portion without going through every single section with their participation. I think the point is they would like to participate in all of the motions, so we should go back through all of the motions, see where it gets
Yeah.
confusing.
That could make it for a very long night.
Sure, Jeff.
I'm just a little nervous. It sounds like we're getting to a very slippery slope here about, keeping trust with the general public and this double jeopardy. We don't have a 100% attendance policy. If we wanted to do that, we should just say, we don't hear any business unless 100% of the board's present. That's why we have the quorum. We could go down to 4 and still function.
Sure.
I just get very nervous about, we want to keep the public engaged. We want them to feel like they're heard and feel like it's fair. And then we have this one where, we might have had that extra vote that was needed. The one member was absent. Let's go ahead and reopen it. I just feel like that's getting to be a very, very...
I agree, and I just want to understand sort of the process or what we could potentially run into, any hurdles, as a board if such a scenario came about. That's all.
Yeah.
I think we have in the past, I think, done a good job about trying to make sure we have a quorum, and I think we've.
So if I could just jump in, because Lisa has a section here about reconsidering votes from Robert's, I think this is from Robert's rules, right, Lisa? So it's like what Attorney Saucier said, it's really a change situation. So it wouldn't be that, I wouldn't recommend like a board member couldn't be in attendance for some reason, and they say, I disagree with all of the board's votes, and let's reconsider at the next meeting. I would say, well, what is the change situation? Not that I get into talking about applications outside of the meeting, but I would just say, well, you'll need a change situation, or there needs to be more information.
Right.
And in the case of the one that we did reconsider years ago, there was new information that I had, and it made it so that the application could not be approved. So it was very, the bar was very high. And then as far as, and then that was after we had already approved it fully. It wasn't like we had done several standards and then moved it to the next meeting to finish up standards. It was already approved. So it was the global motion, which is, I think, what you're referencing as well.
Okay.
Well, and just one more question. So a different scenario. So, members I'm the new member on the board. So let's imagine there's a controversial application that's before the board. It's voted on one way or the other, and somebody goes to court, and there's a remand back down to this board. Now, I suppose a remand could be for various different things. It could be findings of fact, but it could be something more substantial, perhaps. There was 6 standards that the board forgot to, make findings on. Right. Can the new member, if the new member looks at or the new members, because it could be several, reviews all those tapes or audio, visual stuff and goes through all the records and everything, can the new members then participate on remand, or do they just have to abstain, saying I wasn't part of the original decision?
That's a good question. I've seen it come up. I think the best practice is to abstain.
Okay.
If you hadn't heard it. Where I've seen it becomes a little more difficult is when there's so substantial turnover on the board that sometimes even none of the original, or like 2 of the members are there, right? And so then I think, I don't know how that would be. You may even need to ask the judge for some guidance on the remand, but I think that's what I would do personally. But in lieu of any guidance, I think I would fall back on the general rule, which is, if you've read everything. The difficulty for me, not to get to sort of think too out of the box, is that you can't typically change when it's remanded, you don't change your vote. Mm-hmm. It's for a very specific reason, to provide the findings of fact to support the vote that happened already. The only time that would happen is if a court overturns a decision, right, and finds a denial. But a remand, the purpose of a remand, and I've worked on cases when, and I don't do as much personally in court now. I work with one of my litigation colleagues. But when I was doing it, I would always ask for some specific guidance to say, essentially, this is for the sole purpose of findings of fact. That is the general rule, but I'd like to see it so that the board members could be reminded of that. And to retain jurisdiction, so it goes to the same judge. And that's getting a little bit in the weeds, but if you don't say they retain jurisdiction, it actually gets appealed again separately.
So, I mean, if it's overturned, it comes back to us, we start over, we start
If
fresh.
it's overturned,
The
it's a
entire
denial.
board.
The court overturns your decision, and then that can be, it's not remanded. It's just overturned. And that can then be appealed, that decision is a final decision of the Superior Court, and that can go up to the Maine Supreme Court. And the Maine Supreme Court hears cases all the time from local decisions. So that would be the next step. And then the Maine Supreme Court would review the decision to determine whether to uphold it or
But
not.
if they overturn us on something, it's not coming back to us. to
That's right.
do
If
a
it's
do-over.
overturned, it's a denial.
Okay.
Yeah. The court will remand it, will remand a decision if they think they're not ready to necessarily overturn it or support it. They need more information to be able to conduct sufficient judicial review, which means findings of fact. So that's what they'll send it back down. You don't disturb your underlying votes, typically, and I would say almost always. What you're doing is filling in the blanks. They're going to say, can you let us know why you voted that way? Provide more sufficient findings. And then the board can then review whether there was substantial evidence in the record based on what you found. Yep. That's all I
Thank
have.
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Phil, sorry, I had one.
Okay, yeah, no worries.
No.
We never finish this early.
No.
Okay. You got to use up the time. Yeah.
No. This one's easy. So during our meetings, we sometimes have correspondences from staff, and it's just general correspondence.
Yes.
So I guess we want to just discuss what's a good practice for receiving general correspondence from the public and from neighbors and citizens. There isn't. I guess we just want to sort of understand what's a good way to sort of process
So
that.
correspondence that's sort of outside of an application.
Outside of a specific application, but specific to city planning, let's say.
I mean, I think you can receive it. So one option is some boards, they simply receive it, they acknowledge receipt, something for you to take into consideration. It's not necessarily an action item per se, right? So then there would have to be an action item. If like, for example, I'm just thinking theoretically, if there's a request from a member of the public to consider an amendment to the zoning ordinance, right? First of all, you may have to think about whether it should start the council or not, depending on the town. Sometimes planning boards have that authority to propose, and the council still has to enact it, but let's just say it's that. So you can receive it, but you don't have to act on it. So like there could be not a majority of the board that even wants to discuss it. You could have someone, the chair could say, actually, I'd like to talk about that, and you put it on the next agenda to discuss a possible amendment, right? So then it'd be an amendment, then it'd be an action item, which presumably would have public comment.
Okay.
But otherwise, I think, you may receive emails all the time, I don't know. You receive them, you acknowledge them, and you decide whether there's an action item that comes out of that or not. I would say there's another option, I think, depending on the community, I see it. Some communities would decide it's a discussion item. It may not be an action item, but it's a discussion item. Again, that's in the discretion of the chair, what you want to do with things like that. But you really act on, again, that's why I go through the jurisdiction as part of anything. You have a certain jurisdiction. You hear applications. That's what you do, right? That's what your ordinance says you do. You hear applications of conditional use, site plan, subdivision, plan, that's what you do. You hear an application, it comes, you have to hear it. It goes on your agenda. You also, or if the city council sends this, an ordinance down for you at the public hearing, that needs to show up on your agenda. But you don't give advisory opinions, right? You don't just start proclaiming your opinion on other parts of the ordinances. You have no jurisdiction to do that. So in terms of correspondence, you can decide to have a conversation. That's in your discretion.
Okay.
Or you can just acknowledge it. You acknowledge receipt. Thank you very much. We received this correspondence from the public, and we acknowledge that. Yeah, it's really within the discretion of the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all I had for
right, thank you.
real. So with that, our next agenda item this evening is General correspondences. Emily?
Do you want to skip mine, because we have time and it's getting late, and just go to the two others received by residents?
Sure. Meaning you want to just table the long-range planning committee?
If we have
report
time, I'll
request?
get to it, but
Okay.
it's getting to be almost 9 o'clock, so
Sure.
you have a little more time to respond to that, too.
Sure. So with that, with our general correspondences, we received some general correspondence from a few residents regarding questions and thoughts and recommendations on meeting minutes. Actually, in fact, they were both in regards to meeting minutes. So we've received those, and we've begun as a board to discuss ways to enhance or provide additional clarity when we can within the meeting minutes. I know Emily and Lisa are working on ways to do that and assist. So I think we can provide some recommendations or thoughts if the board wishes to this evening, or we can make it another agenda item down the road if we'd like to, but Rob?
I mean, I got a couple of thoughts. As we heard tonight, it's meant to be sort of a concise overview of where the meeting was held, when the meeting was held, who was in attendance, what motions were made, what the vote was on those motions. That's at the minimum. I don't, and I think that we have included in the past from the general public who made public comment and their address, I believe. No, it was name, address. I like the idea of the form where they check either I'm opposed or for or against, whichever way you want to verbalize it, or neither. But as Jeff said, and I know half the people come here not thinking to speak, but then finding the urge to speak. Maybe we have a form on the podium where they can then sign in quickly, you know, Rob Biggs, this address, opposed, boom. Because I think I don't think that we want to get in the business of listening to public comment one at a time and then having Lisa decide were they opposed or against. I think that we need to, I would like to also see timestamps, not for each individual speaker, but for at the start of each individual item and when the item ended, when the next one started. You know, so public comment started at XYZ time and it ended at this time. I don't think we want to have staff writing down every, you know, so-and-so talked for 3.5 minutes, so-and-so, because then we'll start to show that some people talk over 3.5 or 5 minutes. But I think we just need to just say, public comment started at this time, public comment, and that gets you close enough that you can review it on that specific item. We've already identified item 1, 2, and 3 of the evening, which time they started and which time they stopped. If there was public comment, when that started, when that stopped, and leave it at that. And just leave it clean. We obviously, when we have to have our, if there's motions made, that has to be verbalized. Emily gives a brief overview that will be written into the minutes, but I don't want it to turn into an almost transcript, but not a real transcript, because we've got one. If we didn't have the technology we have today, I totally get it. But we've got audio and video. As Jeff said, you can even tell how somebody was. Were they aggressive? Were they excited? Were they, you know, whatever. You can get time and temp and everything out of that.
Yep. Jeff?
Well, I agree that we always stick to our guns that the formal record is the video. But I like the idea of putting the burden of determining the general public stance on them, whether the sign-up sheet is on the podium and they can kind of check off. And if they happen to not check it off, I mean, we're required to identify who they were, where they live, that they spoke, right? They were engaged in the public comment. But I think that for those of us who are tech savvy and go through and research this, and board members that have to get caught up, the video record is great. But for some people, it's a little bit more challenging for them to research all of that. And I think that when you're looking at a snapshot, having a very brief synopsis is very helpful. I'm looking at what's in our packet is just from, I think, the 19th of, or 2019. It was just very quick, you know. Kathy Stackpole, 17 Christopher Terrace. She spoke in opposition of the proposal. Concerns about non-conforming use, seasonality, and receipt of the hearing notification. It's just a quick summary. That's what they spoke about. Move on. I think that's just very sufficient without trying to get into a transcript, because I don't want to. I want to walk that line and not get into a transcript. But I think that people that are reviewing, knowing that the person was in opposition, and I don't want us to get into the position where Lisa has to have the burden of deciding were they in opposition or not. So if we have a sign-in sheet that they can check off, and then we can summarize quickly what they said, I think that's great, because there is a list of people here at this particular meeting, but it's basically a sentence and a half of what they spoke about, what their concerns were. And if you want to know more about it, then we dig in and find the video transcript. So I would be in favor of having staff put a little bit of a summary in conjunction with a checkoff sheet that when you speak, you can put your position or that you're neutral. So that we're not determining that, but general public has a record of the item that they kind of touched on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I think Emily's recommendation on this sign-in sheet and a checkbox, I think could be a good step. I think, as Mr. Saucier said, the meeting minutes they're factual, summary, and the key for me is factual. Something that's clearly, it's not a understanding or misunderstanding, but if someone's checking the box, I'm for, against, or neutral, I think that's easy. I think I think I'd like to try and see how brief we can be without writing a full dissertation. I think maybe just bullet points, zoning, in opposition, zoning, traffic, maybe just some simple bullet points. That way there's, again, as we heard this evening, not putting words into anyone's mouth, but
Topic headings.
topic heading, sure.
Yeah, in conjunction with a timestamp.
Timestamps will be helped too, within reason. I think we don't, like Rob said, we don't need a 1 minute here, 1 minute. We don't need it by the minute, but a general.
But public hearing started such and such a time, ended such and such a time.
Sure.
Is that doable?
I think Lisa has a question here.
Yeah, she's got the mic out.
So my question is that, as the person that's taking the minutes, when people get up and speak, they could speak for 10 minutes. And during that 10 minutes, they could list 20 things that they have an issue with. So yes, we could do a condensed version of their concerns, but what happens if I only list 5 and it was the 6th thing that they were most concerned with, but I didn't know that? So then you're asking me to determine what the public's big concerns are when they get up and speak. It might not just be traffic. It could be pedestrian. It could be the dogs walking. It could be kids on bikes. It could be people backing out of driveways.
It could be 5 different things.
Right.
And they could be positive on 2.
Right. And so you're asking me to determine what the concerns are that these people have that are most important to condense into minutes. I can do that. But what happens when the public then starts to come forward and 22 people say, you know what, you didn't gather the right information. You only gathered a portion of it. I really wanted you to tell me the 22 things that I said. And you didn't put that in the record, so it's not a full record, so I want it altered. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear when I'm preparing the minutes. Even if we review them in the office, they still might not be the condensed version of what the public is looking for. So I guess I just need clarification for my purposes for what it is you want me to be Because that was the concern, was that if you're asking me as the secretary to determine what the public thinks is the most important things to have as their comments.
Yeah, I share your concern. I think, not to simply state, but I think if a resident says, I'm concerned with traffic, sure, that one's easy. But if they keep discussing and then say, I saw a stray dog that almost got hit by a car, that's a problem. Perhaps that's not specific enough, but
Right, but they could go from traffic to trees to pollution and now she's got quite a laundry list. Now, I know other people do come up and they're interested in traffic, and they cite 5 or 6 different things with regards to traffic, and that's clean. The problem is if she does it and says traffic for Bob, and then Mary gets up and has 17 different things on her laundry list, which ones does she do all 17? That could get pretty onerous on her time, that we have a limited staff time to deal with.
yeah, it's definitely not the intent to create added burden, of course. So it's, Jeff?
Yeah, I don't understand why we even need to do this. I mean, why are we going to ask Lisa to editorialize the public's opinion? And why do we need to put it in there at all? I mean, I'd rather keep the minutes simple, to the point, who was here, who was present, who spoke, what the motions were. We have a video recording of the whole thing. If people want to get more in depth, let them listen to it or watch it.
Yeah.
It creates more work for her, more work for the city, it's more expensive, and it serves no purpose.
Yeah, so I guess for me, so let's, just my experience. So, for example, I'm fortunate enough to go to other planning board meetings in other municipalities for my work. So if I go to a meeting one night and I haven't been before the South Portland board for quite some time, I only know, or I'm only familiar with 1 or 2 board members that I've been before in the past or presented to. If I come in for the night of my meeting and I grab an agenda with the meeting minutes that are printed at the table, and it has a brief summary, and it says the last meeting was based on, it was this application, and maybe it's similar to our application tonight, or maybe it's not, or something that I'm presenting, and it has a brief summary of 13 neighbors spoke in opposition, and there were a few bullet points of X, Y, and Z as to their concerns. Me as an applicant on a new submission or on a new item helps me on topics of discussion and concerns that the board has as well, or maybe other members have of the public. So from other applicants, I see the benefit. Not so much for the board because we're here, but I think that's perhaps a benefit is to other applicants coming in that don't come to every meeting or don't have an opportunity to review all the minutes. It's just it is a quick little snapshot. I agree. I don't want to create more.
Right, but if you
burden
were
for Lisa.
concerned, I mean, if you were the applicant's representative and concerned about the neighbors, I would assume you would have watched the video of the previous meetings.
Or should have.
That's a fair statement, sure.
And it's on you and not on the
Right.
staff to then write opinions of everyone's.
Yeah,
Sure, yep.
By putting in the topics of the for, against, or neutral, I think if you have a summary just of that alone, that's going to tell you a lot about what happened during that part of the meeting. If you have 15 people were opposed and 0 were for it, that tells you a lot right there. And then you can go back and read the timestamps. If you have the timestamps in there, you can go back in and say, oh, this was a hotly debated issue. This is a timestamp, and go in and watch that clip and be done with it. I don't think we need to put more work on already strained, staff is strained as it is, right? They're getting stuff, they have too many things they have to do. So,
Thank you.
simplify it.
Jim?
I looked at those meeting minutes. I mean, there were some meeting minutes where the public spoke, like the August 20th, 2019. And there was like maybe a sentence or two about what each person said. That didn't seem too onerous, although from my very first meeting here, we had a public hearing on an ordinance amendment, and there were people speaking, sometimes for a long time, about all sorts of things. And we could end up in a situation like the September 3rd meeting, I think it was. I looked at that, and people spoke, and there were paragraphs about what the individual, public speaker said, and the minutes just went on and on and on. And so my feeling now is that it's better to have just the names and addresses and whether they're for or against the application. I agree with Jeff and Matt down there. I think if we have them time-stamped so that people can later very quickly see exactly what people said, if they really, really want to know, they can find it. We'll be able to find it later if we want to find it. Because if I'm trying to look at an entire application and we're about to vote on something one night and I just want to go back and look at the record again, I'm honestly not going to look at all the minutes as to what the public said. I'll probably look at the video again because I'll really want to know what they said. And I think it's unfair to Lisa to try to summarize.
Thank you, Jim. Jeff?
I guess I'm still kind of torn. I don't want to put Lisa in a difficult position, and I agree her time is valuable, but I feel like those people that are typically well prepared and have a lot of very key points oftentimes submit paperwork. And this one had, I know it was a very long application. Three of us sat through it, and it was Neil Schuster at the time. He spoke as a resident because he was the planning board chair at the time. And he spoke in opposition to the application, noting various concerns about the proposal that are documented in a letter he submitted for the file. Boom, So if they're that wordy, I don't know. I kind of feel like we need to have a little bit of that vibe in there because it's traditionally how the minutes were run. And the case you brought up as well. But I don't want to, how do we draw that line? It's how do we give guidance to Lisa to draw that line? So at the very least, I think we should start with a sign-up sheet that checks off in support or opposed. That way we can have the date, the name, and the location they live and whether they were in opposition. I think that would be an improvement over what we have right now.
Thank you, Jeff. Rob?
One other thing, some of those minutes that were shown as examples, we didn't have video. Audio was a tape player stuck on the middle of the desk. The meetings were held downstairs in a conference room that held 20 people, period. I mean, I've been to some of those downstairs, and you're sitting crammed against the wall with, 15 other people, and that was the extent. We didn't have this type of a scenario. And so at that time, you probably had to put a little bit more in the minutes because the record was weak at best by comparison today.
Sure.
Which you can tell if someone's, scratching their head while they're giving you their opinion. I mean, you've got everything you could possibly get. And again, timestamp, I agree with the timestamp because, geez, trying to wade through some of these things, city council meetings and this, trying to find, well, what was it, where did they say that, And it's like, well, I don't want to just keep fast forward, back it up, fast forward, back. Oh, here it is. Be great. Just here's when this item started. Here's when the public comment, if that was started. Here's this motion. If you want to even timestamp motions, maybe. But I would just at least timestamp the item, timestamp the public comment, and then when did it end? Boom. And then that way it gives me, I can get around pretty quickly at that point. And I am not tech savvy, but it at least gets me there. But again, the more you put on, as the attorney said tonight, the more you put on paper, the more you're maybe leaving off the paper. And that worries me, because we've got record, word for word, verbatim. I mean, I've had public call me out on things saying timestamp such and such. And if you listen to what I said and actually listen to it versus what was written down by someone that made an opinion, you could then go back and realize, well, he actually didn't mean that. This is the way it came out, but the way he said it was, right? So, I mean, you've got a really good piece of technology here to use, and why to put more and more on paper? I just think we should just keep it as clean as possible to avoid making decisions as to what should be and not should be included.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. So, Emily, Lisa, it sounds like the board perhaps maybe at our first pass or first test, a sign-up sheet with for, against, and neutral. We'll have applicant or resident's name and address. We'll have that information and timestamps in that general area, and perhaps that's a starting point.
And if they don't fill out that form, and we have a blank up here and they don't fill it out there either, just put it down and don't say anything, no neutral, nothing, just Mary Smith, this is the address.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
we already do have a sign-in sheet, so we will just, and it is at the podium, so we will just modify it, ask people to sign
Right, but some
in.
may say, I'm not putting my name down there.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
then the language that we'll use is in support, opposed, and neither for nor against, if
Right,
that's okay with
whatever,
everyone.
yeah.
That's fine, yep.
And then
Yeah.
we will timestamp the beginning of public comment and the end of public comment during the hearings, and we will timestamp the beginning of each
item.
of each application item. We will not go farther with timestamps right now than
Yeah, I
that.
don't think you need to dig into when motions were made and things like that.
And then if we could just ask the chair to help us by reminding people to sign in, and then
Absolutely.
self-certifying what they are signing in for. And like you say, Rob, if they don't sign in, of course, we'll still mark them, but we'll just
Right.
mention that they didn't sign in.
Right.
And I'll add some language to the public hearing description, and I can be specific about the intent of working through meeting minutes and for the meeting records.
Great. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Phil. Would you like to, Emily, speak about the long-range planning committee report?
Sure, and it's getting late, so we don't feel like you need to stay to fill this out tonight, but our long-range planning committee, who's been charged in our ordinances with implementation of the long-range plan and monitoring its implementation of the comp plan, is working to put together their report of what's been done, what hasn't been done, and then, figuring out what resources may be needed. In a perfect world, we would do this before our budget cycle, so next year when we do this, we'll be looking to probably do it a little earlier. However, what we've done is we've compiled, the planning departments worked with the long-range planning committee, and we've compiled all of the different strategies. So if you look at the back of the comp plan, there's a strategy matrix, which goes through each goal and action item and who's the lead to make sure that happens and who's the support. I would say planning department and planning board do have a number of items that we're asked to work on for implementation. So the long-range planning committee's goal in this is really to gain information, so if something hasn't been started, or maybe it's not applicable because maybe it's been resolved, or it's complete, they just are looking for that information. It's not to judge you that it hasn't been done yet. This is a 12-year plan. It's more to figure out where we're at, and then what resources will be needed into the future. So they've asked everyone, every entity for about 5 weeks. You're the first to get your report. We'll be sending the rest of the reports out this week. There were actually a number of reports to complete, so it's good. We've got them all done, and it'll go out to every department, entity, organization, board, or committee that's listed in that comp plan. So you'll have till April 5th to send it back, so you have the next meeting and the meeting after to put together a, check off where we are. So maybe if one planning board member wants to kind of review where we're at and bring it back at another meeting, you could do it that way, or we could just do it openly at another meeting. I just think the March 19th agenda is going to be pretty full, so we have a number of applications to review.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Board members, any thoughts, additional questions on this? Perhaps we can take some time and put thoughts together on this and then compile it, and is that one recommendation that we can forward that to you, Emily, or we can have discussion? We have our next meeting, you said was the 19th. And
Yeah,
then-
so we can include it on your meeting. Like we could put it in under, on the agenda, just to keep it on there. And you can review it at the next meeting. I just don't know if you're gonna have a lot of time at that meeting is what I'm getting at.
Sure, we have a meeting on the 2nd of April,
Yes.
so we could perhaps have additional discussion at that meeting on this, if we'd like.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Perhaps
I
that's.
mean, you could also go through it now, but I just don't know that you'll finish it.
I welcome board thoughts, but this is, I mean, as you mentioned, it's the timeframe on this, I mean, to provide comments, but some of these may not have been addressed yet. Board thoughts?
I'd rather put it off to another meeting. I mean, it's 9:20, and I don't want to start going through this now.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeff. I think we can look at this on our own and then regroup at the next meeting if we have time, and we'll have more time April 2nd, it sounds like.
April 2nd as well, yep. All right. Let's do that then, Emily.
I move to lay the question on the table.
Everyone should have one of these, right, around their desk? Rules of order?
I do not. It's just whoever sits there, Matt. Thank you.
It's useful. I mean, I think this is a useful tool. That's why I used it, because we were talking about Robert's Rules of Order. This is a great tool that council.
So I'm pretty sure council had the Robert's Rules of Order put on their iPads. So we can look into having the book
Yeah.
put on your iPad if that's what you want. I'll check
would be-
into it for you.
That'd be handy.
So
Right.
these are, I think this is, having them also available is helpful as well, so.
We would be happy to provide you the laminated sheets too. Or find the other laminated sheets.
Thank you. Emily, any other planning department updates or discussions?
So we have the climate plan info session tomorrow. I provided you kind of updates along the way on that plan. So now this is another opportunity to just provide the public similar updates. Shannon's been working on that internally with other staff members. So that's 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And then March 11th, we have a joint long-range planning committee and city council meeting. And one of the topics will be just here's the reporting tool and next steps. And we are reviewing multiple applications. If you look at the projects under review tab on our webpage, that everything's there. So, or it's updated as of today, right, Lisa? So anything that you want to take a look at, it's all available to see. And that's basically it for right now.
What was the date of the joint meeting?
March 11th.
March 11th.
Thank you, Emily. Planning board comments, any
I do have
items to
one
discuss?
comment related to the topic earlier about the video and the transcription. There are very cheap or inexpensive tools that can be used to transcribe the video into a document, right? So it'll transcribe the entire video, word for word, put it in a Word document, and then from there you can actually either print it or, save it and post it that way, or you can edit it and move it into a minutes type format that would save time for anyone who has that So there's this technology out there that can help these meetings, these proceedings along. We just have to look for it and put that, if you want something more advanced, there's more advanced tools out there, but there's very basic free tools that you can use to transcribe, which I think could be helpful if we're concerned about the minutes and what we're capturing and not capturing.
Yes, thank you, Matt. We, Emily and I have had discussions about looking into something like that that helps work through that process.
With the experience of voice to text on I'm not sure I trust it.
It's not an Apple product.
It's not totally AI at this point.
There are better tools out there, though, than that. So let me just put it out there. There are ways you can read all kinds of things so you have to find a good solution.
Sure, yeah, we've had discussion, Emily and I, about just tools to, make it more efficient for them. So we're looking into it. Any other comments from board members? No?
Yeah, I'm moving to close the meeting.
Thank you for the motion, Rob. The motion to adjourn 9:24 p.m.
I'll second that.
Second by Jeff. Move to adjourn. Thank you.